Chapter 6 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova, Episode 1, Childhood, Chapter 6. My grandmother's death and its consequences. I lose M. de Malipiero's friendship. I have no longer a home. La Tintoretta. I am sent to a clerical seminary. I am expelled from it and confined in a fortress. During supper the conversation turned altogether upon the storm, and the official, who knew the weakness of his wife, told me that he was quite certain I would never travel with her again. Nor I with him, his wife remarked, for in his fearful impiety he exercised the lightning with jokes. Henceforth she avoided me so skilfully that I never could contrive another interview with her. When I returned to Venice, I found my grandmother ill, and I had to change all my habits, for I loved her too dearly not to surround her with every care and attention. I never left her until she had breathed her last. She was unable to leave with me anything, for during her life she had given me all she could, and her death compelled me to adopt an entirely different mode of life. A month after her death, I received a letter from my mother informing me that, as there was no probability of her return to Venice, she had determined to give up the house, and rent of which she was still paying, that she had communicated her intention to the Abbé Grimani, and that I was to be guided entirely by his advice. He was instructed to sell the furniture and to place me, as well as my brothers and my sister, in a good boarding house. I called upon Grimani to assure him of my perfect disposition to obey his commands. The rent of the house had been paid until the end of the year, but as I was aware that the furniture would be sold on the expiration of the term, I placed my wants under no restraint. I had already sold some linen, most of the china, and several tapestries. I now began to dispose of the mirrors, beds, etc. I had no doubt that my conduct would be severely blamed, but I knew likewise that it was my father's inheritance, to which my mother had no claim whatever, and as to my brothers, there was plenty of time before my explanation could take place between them. 4 months afterwards, I had a second letter from my mother, dated from Warsaw, and enclosing another. Here is the translation of my mother's letter. My dear son, I have made here the acquaintance of a learned Minim friar, a Calabrian by birth, whose great qualities have made me think of you every time he has honored me with a visit. A year ago I told them that I had a son who was preparing himself for the church, but that I had not the means of keeping him during his studies, and he promised that my son would become his own child if I could obtain for him from the Queen a bishopric in his native country, and he added that it would be very easy to succeed if I could induce the sovereign to recommend him to her daughter, the Queen of Naples. Full of trust in the Almighty, I threw myself at the feet of Her Majesty, who granted me her gracious protection. She wrote to her daughter, and the worthy friar has been appointed by the Pope to the bishopric of Monterano. Faithful to his promise, the good bishop will take you with him about the middle of next year, as he passes through Venice to reach Calabria. He informs you himself of his intentions in the enclosed letter. Answer him immediately, my dear son, and forward your letter to me. I will deliver it to the bishop. He will pave your way to the highest dignities of the church, and you may imagine my consolation if, in some 20 or 30 years, I had the happiness of seeing you a bishop, at the least. Until his arrival, M. Grimani will take care of you. I give you my blessing, and I am, my dear child, etc., etc. The bishop's letter was written in Latin, and was only a repetition of my mother's. It was full of unction, and informed me that he would tarry but 3 days in Venice. I answered according to my mother's wishes, but those 2 letters had turned my brain. I looked upon my fortune as made. I longed to enter the road which was to lead me to it, and I congratulated myself that I could leave my country without any regret. "Farewell, Venice," I exclaimed. "The days for vanity are gone by, and in the future I will only think of a substantial career." M. Grimani congratulated me warmly on my good luck, and promised all his friendly care to secure a good boarding house, to which I would go at the beginning of the year, and where I would wait for the bishop's arrival. M. de Malipiero, who in his own way had great wisdom, and who saw that in Venice I was plunging headlong into pleasures and dissipation, and was only wasting a precious time, was delighted to see me on the eve of going somewhere else to fulfill my destiny, and much pleased with my ready acceptance of those new circumstances in my life. He read me a lesson which I have never forgotten. The famous precept of the Stoic philosophers, he said to me, "Sequere Deum," can be perfectly explained by these words: give yourself up to whatever fate offers to you, provided you do not feel an invincible repugnance to accept it. He added that it was the genius of Socrates, saepi revocans raro impellens, and that it was the origin of the fata viam inveniunt of the same philosophers. M. de Malipiero's science was embodied in that very lesson, for he had obtained his knowledge by the study of only one book, the Book of Man. However, as if it were to give me the proof that perfection does not exist, and that there is a bad side as well as a good one to everything, a certain adventure happened to me a month afterwards, which, although I was following his own maxims, cost me the loss of his friendship, and which certainly did not teach me anything. The senator fancied that he could trace upon the physiognomy of young people certain signs which marked them out as the special favorites of fortune. When he imagined that he had discovered those signs upon any individual, he would take him in hand and instruct him how to assist fortune by good and wise principles. And he used to say, with a great deal of truth, that a good remedy would turn into poison in the hands of a fool, but that poison is a good remedy when administered by a learned man. He had in my time 3 favorites, in whose education he took great pains. They were, besides myself, Thérèse Eimer, with whom the reader has a slight acquaintance already, and the 3rd was the daughter of the boatman Gardella, a girl 3 years younger than I, who had the prettiest and most fascinating countenance. The speculative old man, in order to assist fortune in her particular case, made her learn dancing, for, he would say, the ball cannot reach the pocket unless someone pushes it. This girl made a great reputation at Stuttgart under the name of Augusta. She was the favorite mistress of the Duke of Württemberg in 1757. She was a most charming woman. The last time I saw her she was in Venice, and she died 2 years afterwards. Her husband, Michel de la Gata, poisoned himself a short time after her death. One day we had all 3 dined with him, and after dinner the senator left us, as was his wont, to enjoy his siesta. The little Gardella, having a dancing lesson to take, went away soon after him, and I found myself alone with Thérèse, whom I rather admired, although I had never made love to her. We were sitting down at the table very near each other, with our backs to the door of the room in which we thought our patron fast asleep, and somehow or other we took a fancy to examine into the difference of conformation between a girl and a boy. But at the most interesting part of our study, a violent blow on my shoulders from a stick followed by another, and which would have been itself followed by many more if I had not ran away, compelled us to abandon our interesting investigation unfinished. I got off without hat or cloak and went home, but in less than a quarter of an hour the old housekeeper of the senator brought my clothes with a letter which contained a command never to present myself again at the mansion of His Excellency. I immediately wrote him an answer in the following terms: "You have struck me while you were the slave of your anger. You cannot therefore boast of having given me a lesson, and I have not learned anything. To forgive you, I must forget that you are a man of great wisdom, and I can never forget it." This nobleman was perhaps quite right not to be pleased with the sight we gave him, yet with all his prudence he proved himself very unwise, for all the servants were acquainted with the cause of my exile, and of course the adventure was soon known through the city, and was received with great merriment. He dared not address any reproaches to Thérèse, as I heard from her soon after, but she could not venture to entreat him to pardon me. The time to leave my father's house was drawing near, and one fine morning I received the visit of a man about 40 years old, with a black wig, a scarlet cloak, and a very swarthy complexion, who handed me a letter from M. Grimani, ordering me to consign to the bearer all the furniture of the house according to the inventory, a copy of which was in my possession. Taking the inventory in my hand, I pointed out every article marked down, except when the said article, having through my instrumentality taken an airing out of the house, happened to be missing, and whenever any article was absent, I said that I had not the slightest idea where it might be. But the uncouth fellow, taking very high note, said loudly that he must know what I had done with the furniture. His manner being very disagreeable to me, I answered that I had nothing to do with him, and as he still raised his voice, I advised him to take himself off as quickly as possible, and I gave him that piece of advice in such a way as to prove him that, at home, I knew I was the most powerful of the two. Feeling it my duty to give information to M. Grimani of what had just taken place, I called him as soon as he was up, but I found that my man was already there, and that he had given his own account of the affair. The abbé, after a very severe lecture to which I had to listen in silence, ordered me to render an account of all the missing articles. I answered that I had found myself under the necessity of selling them to avoid running into debt. This confession threw him in a violent passion. He called me a rascal, said that those things did not belong to me, that he knew what he had to do, and he commanded me to leave his house on the very instant. Mad with rage, I ran for a Jew to whom I wanted to sell what remained of the furniture, but when I returned to my house, I found a bailiff waiting at the door, and he handed me a summons. I looked over it and perceived that it was issued at the instance of Antonio Razzetta. It was the name of the fellow with the swarthy countenance. The seals were already affixed on all the doors, and I was not even allowed to go to my room, for a keeper had been left there by the bailiff. I lost no time, and called upon M. Rosa, to whom I related all the circumstances. After reading the summons, he said, "The seals shall be removed tomorrow morning, and in the meantime I shall summon Razzetta before the avogador. But tonight, my dear friend," he added, "you must beg the hospitality of some of your acquaintances. It has been a violent proceeding, but you shall be paid handsomely for it. The man is evidently acting under M. Grimani's orders." Well, that is their business. I spent the night with Nanette and Martin, and on the following morning, the seals having been taken off, I took possession of my dwelling. Razzetta did not appear before the avogador, and M. Rosa summoned him in my name before the criminal court, and obtained against him a writ of capias, in case he should not obey the second summons. On the third day, M. Grimani wrote to me, commanding me to call upon him. I went immediately. As soon as I was in his presence, he inquired abruptly what my intentions were. I intend to shield myself from your violent proceedings under the protection of the law, and to defend myself against a man with whom I ought never to have had any connection, and who has compelled me to pass the night in a disreputable place." "In a disreputable place?" "Of course. Why was I, against all right and justice, prevented from entering my own dwelling?" "You have possession of it now, but you must go to your lawyer and tell him to suspend all proceedings against Rosetta, who has done nothing but under my instructions. I suspect that your intention was to sell the rest of the furniture. I have prevented it. There is a room at your disposal at St. Chrysostom's, in a house of mine, the first floor of which is occupied by La Tintoretta, our first opera dancer. Send all your things there, and come and dine with me every day. Your sister and your brothers have been provided with a comfortable home. Therefore everything is now arranged for the best." I called at once upon M. Rosa, to whom I explained all that had taken place, and his advice being to give way to M. Grimani's wishes, I determined to follow it. Besides, the arrangement offered the best satisfaction I could obtain, as to be a guest at his dinner table was an honour for me. I was likewise full of curiosity respecting my new lodging under the same roof with La Tintoretta, who was much talked of, owing to a certain Prince of Waldeck who was extravagantly generous with her. The bishop was expected in the course of the summer. I had therefore only 6 months more to wait in Venice before taking the road which would lead me, perhaps, to the throne of St. Peter. Everything in the future assumed in my eyes the brightest hue, and my imagination revelled amongst the most radiant beams of sunshine. My castles in the air were indeed most beautiful. I dined the same day with M. Grimani, and I found myself seated next to Rosetta, an unpleasant neighbour, but I took no notice of him. When the meal was over, I paid a last visit to my beautiful house in St. Samuel's parish, and sent all I possessed in a gondola to my new lodging. I did not know Signora Tintoretta, but I was well acquainted with her reputation, character, and manners. She was but a poor dancer, neither handsome nor plain, but a woman of wit and intellect. Prince Waldeck spent a great deal for her, and yet he did not prevent her from retaining the titular protection of a noble Venetian of the Lynn family, now extinct, a man about 60 years of age, who was her visitor at every hour of the day. This nobleman, who knew me, came to my room towards the evening, with the compliments of the lady, who, he added, was delighted to have me in her house, and would be pleased to receive me in her intimate circle. To excuse myself for not having been the first to pay my respects to the signora, I told M. Lin that I did not know she was my neighbour, that M. Grimani had not mentioned the circumstance, otherwise I would have paid my duties to her before taking possession of my lodging. After this apology I followed the ambassador. He presented me to his mistress, and the acquaintance was made. She received me like a princess, took off her glove before giving me her hand to kiss, mentioned my name before 5 or 6 strangers who were present, and whose names she gave me, and invited me to take a seat near her. As she was a native of Venice, I thought it was absurd for her to speak French to me, and I told her that I was not acquainted with that language, and would feel grateful if she would converse in Italian. She was surprised at my not speaking French, and I said I would cut but a poor figure in her drawing room, as they seldom spoke any other language there, because she received a great many foreigners. I promised to learn French. Prince Waldeck came in during the evening. I was introduced to him, and he gave me a very friendly welcome. He could speak Italian very well, and during the carnival he shewed me great kindness. He presented me with a good snuff-box as a reward for a very poor sonnet which I had written for his dear Grizellini. This was her family name. She was called Tintoretta because her father had been a dyer. The Tintoretta had greater claims than Juliet to the admiration of sensible men. She loved poetry, and if it had not been that I was expecting the bishop, I would have fallen in love with her. She was herself smitten with a young physician of great merit, named Righelini, who died in the prime of life, and whom I still regret. I shall have to mention him in another part of my memoirs. Towards the end of the carnival, my mother wrote to M. Grimani that it would be a great shame if the bishop found me under the roof of an opera dancer, and he made up his mind to lodge me in a respectable and decent place. He took the Abbé Tosello into consultation, and the two gentlemen thought that the best thing that they could do for me would be to send me to a clerical seminary. They arranged everything unknown to me, and the abbé undertook to inform me of their plan and to obtain from me a gracious consent. But when I heard him speak with beautiful flowers of rhetoric for the purpose of gilding the bitter pill, I could not help bursting into joyous laughter, and I astounded his reverence when I expressed my readiness to go anywhere he might think right to send me. The plan of the two worthy gentlemen was absurd, for at the age of 17, and with a nature like mine, the idea of placing me in a seminary ought never to have been entertained, but, ever a faithful disciple of Socrates, feeling no unconquerable reluctance, and the plan, on the contrary, appearing to me rather a good joke, I not only gave a ready consent, but I even longed to enter the seminary. I told M. Grimani I was prepared to accept anything, provided Rosetta had nothing to do with it. He gave me his promise, but he did not keep it when I left the seminary. I have never been able to decide whether this Grimani was kind because he was a fool, or whether his stupidity was the result of his kindness, but all his brothers were the same. The worst trick that Dame Fortune can play upon an intelligent young man is to place him under the dependence of a fool. A few days afterwards, having been dressed as a pupil of a clerical seminary by the care of the abbé, I was taken to Saint Cyprien de Muran and introduced to the rector. The patriarchal church of Saint Cyprian is served by an order of the monks, founded by the blessed Jerome Miani, a nobleman of Venice. The rector received me with tender affection and great kindness, but in his address, which was full of unction, I thought I could perceive a suspicion on his part that my being sent to the seminary was a punishment, or at least a way to put a stop to an irregular life, and, feeling hurt in my dignity, I told him at once, "Reverend Father, I do not think that any one has the right of punishing me." "No, no, my son," he answered, "I only meant that you would be very happy with us." We were then shown 3 halls, in which we found at least 150 seminarists, 10 or 12 schoolrooms, the refectory, the dormitory, the gardens for play hours, and every pain was taken to make me imagine life in such a place the happiest that could fall to the lot of a young man, and to make me suppose that I would even regret the arrival of the bishop. Yet they all tried to cheer me up by saying that I would only remain there 5 or 6 months. Their eloquence amused me greatly. I entered the seminary at the beginning of March, and prepared myself for my new life by passing the night between my 2 young friends, Nanette and Martin, who bathed their pillows with tears. They could not understand, and this was likewise the feeling of their aunt and of their good Aunt Rosa, how a young man like myself could show such obedience. The day before going to the seminary, I had taken care to entrust all my papers to Madame Manzoni. They made a large parcel, and I left it in her hands for 15 years. The worthy old lady is still alive, and with her 90 years she enjoys good health and a cheerful temper. She received me with a smile, and told me that I would not remain 1 month in the seminary. "I beg your pardon, madam, but I am very glad to go there, and intend to remain until the arrival of the bishop." "You do not know your own nature, and you do not know your bishop, with whom you will not remain very long either." The abbé accompanied me to the seminary in a gondola, but at Saint Michel he had to stop in consequence of a violent attack of vomiting which seized me suddenly. The apothecary cured me with some mint water. I was indebted for this attack to the 2 frequent sacrifices which I had been offering on the altar of love. Any lover who knows what his feelings were when he found himself with the woman he adored, and with the fear that it was for the last time, will easily imagine my feelings during the last hours that I expected ever to spend with my 2 charming mistresses. I could not be induced to let the last offering be the last, and I went on offering until there was no more incense left. The priest committed me to the care of the rector, and my luggage was carried to the dormitory, where I went myself to deposit my cloak and my hat. I was not placed amongst the adults because, notwithstanding my size, I was not old enough. Besides, I would not shave myself through vanity, because I thought that the down on my face left no doubt of my youth. It was ridiculous, of course, but when does man cease to be so? We get rid of our vices more easily than of our follies. Tyranny has not had sufficient power over me to compel me to shave myself, if it is only in that respect that I have found tyranny to be tolerant. To which school do you wish to belong? Asked the rector. To the dogmatic, Reverend Father. I wish to study the history of the Church. I will introduce you to the Father Examiner. I am a doctor in divinity, most reverend Father, and do not want to be examined. It is necessary, my dear son. Come with me. This necessity appeared to me an insult, and I felt very angry, but a spirit of revenge quickly whispered to me the best way to mystify them, and the idea made me very joyful. I answered so badly all the questions propounded in Latin by the examiner, I made so many solecisms, that he felt it his duty to send me to an inferior class of grammar, in which, to my great delight, I found myself the companion of some 20 young urchins of about 10 years, who, hearing that I was doctor in divinity, kept on saying, Accipiamus pecuniam et mitamus asinum in patriam suam. Our play hours afforded me great amusement. My companions of the dormitory, who were all in the class of philosophy at least, looked down upon me with great contempt, and when they spoke of their own sublime discourses, they laughed if I appeared to be listening attentively to their discussions, which, as they thought, must have been perfect enigmas to me. I did not intend to betray myself, but an accident, which I could not avoid, forced me to throw off the mask. Father Barbarigo, belonging to the convent of the Salutation at Venice, whose pupil I had been in physics, came to pay a visit to the rector, and seeing me as we were coming from mass, paid me his friendly compliments. His first question was to inquire what science I was studying, and he thought I was joking when I answered that I was learning the grammar. The rector having joined us, I left them together and went to my class. An hour later, the rector sent for me. "Why did you feign such ignorance at the examination?" he asked. "Why," I answered, "were you unjust enough to compel me to the degradation of an examination?" He looked annoyed and escorted me to the dogmatic school, where my comrades of the dormitory received me with great astonishment, and in the afternoon, at playtime, they gathered around me and made me very happy with their professions of friendship. One of them, about 15 years old, and who at the present time must, if still alive, be a bishop, attracted my notice by his features as much as by his talents. He inspired me with a very warm friendship, and during recess, instead of playing skittles with the others, we always walked together. We conversed upon poetry, and we both delighted in the beautiful odes of Horace. We liked Ariosto better than Tasso, and Petrarch had our whole admiration, while Tassoni and Muratori, who had been his critics, were the special objects of our contempt. We were such fast friends after 4 days of acquaintance that we were actually jealous of each other, and to such an extent that if either of us walked about with any seminarist, the other would be angry and sulk like a disappointed lover. dormitory was placed under the supervision of a lay friar, and it was his province to keep us in good order. After supper, accompanied by this lay friar, who had the title of prefect, we all proceeded to the dormitory. There everyone had to go to his own bed and to undress quietly after having said his prayers in a low voice. When all the pupils were in bed, the prefect would go to his own. A large lantern lighted up the dormitory, which had the shape of a parallelogram 80 yards by 10. The beds were placed at equal distances, and to each bed there were a fold stool, a chair, and room for the trunk of the seminarist. At one end was the washing place, and at the other the bed of the prefect. The bed of my friend was opposite mine, and the lantern was between us. The principal duty of the prefect was to take care that no pupil should go and sleep with one of his comrades, for such a visit was never supposed an innocent one. It was a cardinal sin, and bed being accounted the place for sleep and not for conversation, it was admitted that a pupil who slept out of his own bed did so only for immoral purposes. So long as he stopped in his own bed, he could do what he liked. So much the worse for him if he gave himself up to bad practices. It has been remarked in Germany that it is precisely in those institutions for young men in which the directors have taken most pains to prevent onanism that this vice is most prevalent. Those who had framed the regulations in our seminary were stupid fools, who had not the slightest knowledge of either morals or human nature. Nature has wants which must be administered to, and Tissot is right only as far as the abuse of nature is concerned. But his abuse would very seldom occur if the directors exercised proper wisdom and prudence, and if they did not make a point of forbidding it in a special and peculiar manner. Young people give way to dangerous excesses from a sheer delight in disobedience, a disposition very natural to humankind since it began with Adam and Eve. I had been in the seminary for 9 or 10 days, when one night I felt someone stealing very quietly in my bed. My hand was at once clutched, and my name whispered. I could hardly restrain my laughter. It was my friend, who, having chanced to wake up and finding that the lantern was out, had taken a sudden fancy to pay me a visit. I very soon begged him to go away for fear the prefect should be awake, for in such a case we should have found ourselves in a very unpleasant dilemma, and most likely would have been accused of some abominable offense. As I was giving him that good advice, we heard someone moving, and my friend made his escape. But immediately after he had left me, I heard the fall of some person, and at the same time the hoarse voice of the prefect exclaiming, "Ah, villain! Wait until tomorrow, until tomorrow!" After which threat he lighted the lantern and returned to his couch. The next morning, before the ringing of the bell for rising, the rector, followed by the prefect, entered the dormitory and said to us, "Listen to me, all of you. You are aware of what has taken place this last night. 2 amongst you must be guilty, but I wish to forgive them, and to save their honor, I promise that their names shall not be made public. I expect every one of you to come to me for confession before recess." He left the dormitory, and we dressed ourselves. In the afternoon, in obedience to his orders, we all went to him and confessed, after which ceremony we repaired to the garden, where my friend told me that, having unfortunately met the prefect after he left me, he had thought that the best way was to knock him down, in order to get him to reach his own bed without being known. "And now," I said, "you are certain of being forgiven, for, of course, you have wisely confessed your error?" "You're joking," answered my friend. "Why, the rector would not have known any more than he knows at present, even if my visit to you had been paid with a criminal intent." Then you must have made a false confession. You are, at all events, guilty of disobedience. That may be, but the rector is responsible for the guilt, as he used compulsion. My dear friend, you argue in a very forcible way, and the very reverend rector must by this time be satisfied that the inmates of our dormitory are more learned than he is himself. No more would have been said about the adventure if, a few nights after, I had not in my turn taken a fancy to return the visit paid by my friend. Towards midnight, having had occasion to get out of bed, and hearing the loud snoring of the prefect, I quickly put out the lantern and went to lie beside my friend. He knew me at once, and gladly received me, but we both listened attentively to the snoring of our keeper, and when it ceased, understanding our danger, I got up and reached my own bed without losing a second. But the moment I got to it I had a double surprise. In the first place, I felt somebody lying in my bed, and in the second I saw the prefect, with a candle in his hand, coming along slowly and taking a survey of all the beds right and left. I could understand the prefect suddenly lighting a candle, but how could I realize what I saw? Namely, one of my comrades sleeping soundly in my bed, with his back turned to me. I immediately made up my mind to feign sleep. After 2 or 3 shake-ins given by the prefect, I pretended to wake up, and my bed companion woke up in earnest. Astonished at finding himself in my bed, he offered me an apology. "I have made a mistake," he said. "As I returned from a certain place in the dark, I found your bed empty and mistook it for mine." "Very likely," I answered. "I had to get up too." "Yes," remarked the prefect, "but how does it happen that you went to bed without making any remark when, on your return, you found your bed already tenanted? And how is it that, being in the dark, you did not suppose that you were mistaken yourself?" "I could not mistaken, for I felt the pedestal of this crucifix of mine, and I knew I was right. As to my companion here, I did not feel him." "It is all very unlikely," answered our Argus, and he went to the lantern, the wick of which he found crushed down. "The wick has been forced into the oil, gentlemen. It has not gone out of itself. It has been the handiwork of one of you, but it will be seen to in the morning." My stupid companion went to his own bed, the prefect lighted the lamp and retired to his rest, and after this scene, which had broken the repose of every pupil, I quietly slept under the appearance of the rector, who, at the dawn of day, came in great fury, escorted by his satellite, the prefect. The rector, after examining the localities and submitting to a lengthy interrogatory first my accomplice, who very naturally was considered as the most guilty, and then myself, whom nothing could convict of the offense, ordered us to get up and go to church to attend mass. As soon as we were dressed, he came back, and addressing us both, he said kindly: "You stand both convicted of a scandalous connivance, and it is proved by the fact of the lantern having been wilfully extinguished. I am disposed to believe that the cause of all these disorders is, if not entirely innocent, at least due only to extreme thoughtlessness. But the scandal given to all your comrades, the outrage offered to the discipline and to the established rules of the seminary, call loudly for punishment. Leave the room." We obeyed, but hardly were we between the double doors of the dormitory than we were seized by 4 servants, who tied our hands behind us and led us to the classroom, where they compelled us to kneel down before the great crucifix. The rector told them to execute his orders, and, as we were in that position, the wretches administered to each of us 7 or 8 blows with a stick or with a rope, which I received, as well as my companion, without a murmur. But the moment my hands were free, I asked the rector whether I could write 2 lines at the very foot of the cross. He gave orders to bring ink and paper, and I traced the following words: I solemnly swear by this God that I have never spoken to the seminarist who was found in my bed. As an innocent person I must protest against this shameful violence. I shall appeal to the justice of his lordship, the patriarch. My comrade in misery signed this protest with me, after which, addressing myself to all the pupils, I read it aloud, calling upon them to speak the truth if any one could say the contrary of what I had written. They, with one voice, immediately declared that we had never been seen conversing together, and that no one knew who had put the lamp out. The rector left the room in the midst of hisses and curses, but he sent us to prison all the same at the top of the house, and in separate cells. An hour afterwards I had my bed, my trunk, and all my things, and my meals were brought to me every day. On the fourth day the Abbé Tusello came for me with instructions to bring me to Venice. I asked him whether he had sifted this unpleasant affair. He told me that he had inquired into it, that he had seen the other seminarists, and that he believed we were both innocent. But the rector would not confess himself in the wrong, and he did not see what could be done. I threw off my seminarist habit, and dressed myself in the clothes I used to wear in Venice, and while my luggage was carried to a boat, I accompanied the abbé to M. Grimani's gondola in which he had come, and we took our departure. On our way, the abbé ordered the boatman to leave my things at the Palace Grimani, adding that he was instructed by M. Grimani to tell me that, if I had the audacity to present myself at his mansion, his servants had received orders to turn me away. He landed me near the convent of the Jesuits without any money, and with nothing but what I had on my back. I went to beg a dinner from Madame Manzoni, who laughed heartily at the realization of her prediction. After dinner I called upon M. Rosa to see whether the law could protect me against the tyranny of my enemies, and after he had been made acquainted with the circumstances of the case, he promised to bring me the same evening at Madame Orio's house an extrajudicial act. I repaired to the place of appointment to wait for him, and to enjoy the pleasures of my two charming friends at my sudden reappearance. It was indeed very great, and the recital of my adventures did not astonish them less than my unexpected presence. M. Rosa came and made me read the act which he had prepared. He did not have time to have it engrossed by the notary, but he undertook to have it ready the next day. I left Madame Orio to take supper with my brother Francois, who resided with a painter called Guardi. He was, like me, much oppressed by the tyranny of Grimani, and I promised to deliver him. Towards midnight I returned to the two amiable sisters, who were expecting me with their usual loving impatience, but, I am bound to confess it with all humility, my sorrows were prejudicial to love in spite of the fortnight of absence and of abstinence. They were themselves deeply affected to see me so unhappy, and pitied me with all their hearts. I endeavoured to console them, and assured them that all my misery would soon come to an end, and that we would make up for lost time. In the morning, having no time, and not knowing where to go, I went to St. Mark's library, where I remained until noon. I left it with the intention of dining with Madame Manzoni, but I was suddenly accosted by a soldier, who informed me that someone wanted to speak to me in a gondola to which he pointed. I answered that the person might as well come out, but he quietly remarked that he had a friend at hand to conduct me forcibly to the gondola, if necessary, and without any more hesitation I went towards it. I had a great dislike to noise or to anything like a public exhibition. I might have resisted, for the soldiers were unarmed, and I would not have been taken up, this sort of arrest not being legal in Venice, but I did not think of it. The Sequere Deum was playing its part. I felt no reluctance. Besides, there are moments in which a courageous man has no courage, or disdains to show it. I enter the gondola, the curtain is drawn aside, and I see my evil genius, Razetta, with an officer. The two soldiers sit down at the prow. I recognize M. Grimani's own gondola. It leaves the landing and takes the direction of the Lido. No one spoke to me, and I remained silent. After half an hour's sailing, the gondola stopped before the small entrance of the fortress St. Andre, at the mouth of the Adriatic, on the very spot where the Bucentaur stands, when, on Ascension Day, the Doge comes to espouse the sea. The sentinel calls the corporal. We alight. The officer who accompanied me introduces me to the major, and presents a letter to him. The major, after reading its contents, gives orders to M. Zen, his adjutant, to consign me to the guardhouse. In another quarter of an hour my conductors take their departure, and M. Zen brings me 3 livres and a half, stating that I would receive the same amount every week. It was exactly the pay of a private. I did not give way to any burst of passion, but I felt the most intense indignation. Late in the evening I expressed a wish to have some food brought, for I could not starve. Then, stretching myself upon a hard camp bed, I passed the night amongst the soldiers without closing my eyes, for these Clavonians were singing, eating garlic, smoking a bad tobacco which was most noxious, and drinking a wine of their own country as black as ink, which nobody else could swallow. Early next morning, Major Pelodoro, the governor of the fortress, called me up to his room and told me that, in compelling me to spend the night in the guardhouse, he had only obeyed the orders he had received from Venice from the Secretary of War. Now, reverend sir, he added, my further orders are only to keep you a prisoner in the fort, and I am responsible for your remaining here. I give you the whole of the fortress for your prison. You shall have a good room in which you will find your bed and all your luggage. Walk anywhere you please, but recollect that if you should escape, you would cause my ruin. I am sorry that my instructions are to give you only 10 sous a day, but if you have any friends in Venice able to send you some money, write to them and trust to me for the security of your letters. Now you may go to bed if you need rest. I was taken to my room. It was large and on the first story, with 2 windows from which I had a very fine view. I found my bed, and I ascertained with great satisfaction that my trunk, of which I had the keys, had not been forced open. The major had kindly supplied my table with all the implements necessary for writing. A Sclavonian soldier informed me very politely that he would attend upon me, and that I would pay him for his services whenever I could, for everyone knew that I had only 10 sous a day. I began by ordering some soup, and when I had dispatched it, I went to bed and slept for 9 hours. When I woke, I received an invitation to supper from the major, and I began to imagine that things, after all, would not be so very bad. I went to the honest governor, whom I found in numerous company. He presented me to his wife and to every person present. I met there several officers, the chaplain of the fortress, a certain Paoli Vida, one of the singers of St. Mark's church, and his wife, a pretty woman, sister-in-law of the major, whom the husband chose to confine in the fort because he was very jealous. Jealous men are not comfortable at Venice, together with several other ladies not very young, but whom I thought very agreeable, owing to their kind welcome. Cheerful as I was by nature, those pleasant guests easily managed to put me in the best of humours. Everyone expressed a wish to know the reasons which could have induced M. Grimani to send me to the fortress, so I gave a faithful account of all my adventures since my grandmother's death. I spoke for 3 hours without any bitterness, and even in a pleasant tone, upon things which, said in a different manner, might have displeased my audience. All expressed their satisfaction and showed so much sympathy that, as we parted for the night, I received from all an assurance of friendship and the offer of their services. This is a piece of good fortune which has never failed me whenever I have been the victim of oppression, until I reached the age of 50. Whenever I met with honest persons expressing a curiosity to know the history of the misfortune under which I was laboring, and whenever I satisfied their curiosity, I have inspired them with friendship, and with that sympathy which was necessary to render them favorable and useful to me. That success was owing to a very simple artifice. It was only to tell my story in a quiet and truthful manner, without even avoiding the facts which told against me. It is a simple secret that many men do not know, because the larger portion of humankind is composed of cowards. A man who always tells the truth must be possessed of great moral courage. Experience has taught me that truth is a talisman, the charm of which never fails in its effect, provided it is not wasted upon unworthy people, and I believe that a guilty man who candidly speaks the truth to his judge has a better chance of being acquitted than the innocent man who hesitates and evades true statements. Of course, the speaker must be young, or at least in the prime of manhood, for an old man finds the whole of nature combined against him. The Major had his joke respecting the visit paid, and returned to the seminarist's bed, but the chaplain and the ladies scolded him. The Major advised me to write up my story and send it to the Secretary of War, undertaking that he should receive it, and he assured me that he would become my protector. All the ladies tried to induce me to follow the Major's advice. End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7, Part 1 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Episode 1, Childhood. Chapter 7, Part 1. The fort, in which the Republic usually kept only a garrison of 100 half-pay Sclavonians, happened to contain at that time 2,000 Albanian soldiers, who were called Samariotes. The Secretary of War, who was generally known under the title of Sage à l'Écriture, had summoned these men from the East in consequence of some impending promotion, as he wanted the officers to be on the spot in order to prove their merits before being rewarded. They all came from the part of Epirus called Albania, which belongs to the Republic of Venice, and they had distinguished themselves in the last war against the Turks. It was for me a new and extraordinary sight to examine some 18 or 20 officers, all of an advanced age, yet strong and healthy, showing the scars which covered their face and their chest, the last naked and entirely exposed through military pride. The lieutenant colonel was particularly conspicuous by his wounds, for, without exaggeration, he had lost 1/4 of his head. He had but one eye, but one ear, and no jaw to speak of. Yet he could eat very well, speak without difficulty, and was very cheerful. He had with him all his family, composed of 2 pretty daughters, who looked all the prettier in their national costume, and of 7 sons, every one of them a soldier. This lieutenant colonel stood 6 feet high, and his figure was magnificent, but his scars so completely deformed his features that his face was truly horrid to look at. Yet I found so much attraction in him that I liked him the moment I saw him, and I would have been much pleased to converse with him if his breath had not sent forth such a strong smell of garlic. All the Albanians had their pockets full of it, and they enjoyed a piece of garlic with as much relish as we do a sugar plum. After this, none can maintain it to be a poison, though the only medicinal virtue it possesses is to excite the appetite, because it acts like a tonic upon a weak stomach. The lieutenant colonel could not read, but he was not ashamed of his ignorance, because not one amongst his men, except the priest and the surgeon, could boast greater learning. Every man, officer or private, had his purse full of gold. Half of them, at least, were married, and we had in the fortress a colony of 500 or 600 women, with God knows how many children. I felt greatly interested in them all. Happy idleness! I often regret thee because thou hast often offered me new sights, and for the same reason I hate old age, which never offers but what I know already, unless I should take up a gazette, but I cared nothing for them in my young days. Alone in my room I made an inventory of my trunk, and having put aside everything of an ecclesiastical character, I sent for a Jew, and sold the whole parcel unmercifully. Then I wrote to M. Rosa, enclosing all the tickets of the articles I had pledged, requesting him to have them sold without any exception, and to forward me the surplus raised by the sale. Thanks to that double operation, I was enabled to give my Sclavonian servant the 10 sous allowed to me every day. Another soldier, who had been a hairdresser, took care of my hair, which I had been compelled to neglect in consequences of the rules of the seminary. I spent my time in walking about the fort and through the barracks, and my 2 places of resort were the major's apartment for some intellectual enjoyment, and the rooms of the Albanian lieutenant colonel for a sprinkling of love. The Albanian, feeling certain that his colonel would be appointed brigadier, solicited the command of the regiment, but he had a rival, and he feared his success. I wrote him a petition, short but so well composed that the Secretary of War, having inquired the name of the author, gave the Albanian his colonelcy. On his return to the fort, the brave fellow, overjoyed at his success, hugged me in his arms, saying that he owed it all to me. He invited me to a family dinner, in which my very soul was parched by his garlic, and he presented me with 12 botargos and 2 pounds of excellent Turkish tobacco. The result of my petition made all the other officers think that they could not succeed without the assistance of my pen, and I willingly gave it to everybody. This entailed many quarrels upon me, for I served all interests, but finding myself the lucky possessor of some 40 sequins, I was no longer in dread of poverty, and laughed at everything. However, I met with an accident which made me pass 6 weeks in a very unpleasant condition. On the 2nd of April, the fatal anniversary of my first appearance in this world, as I was getting up in the morning, I received in my room the visit of a very handsome Greek woman. She told me that her husband, then ensign in the regiment, had every right to claim the rank of lieutenant, and that he would certainly be appointed if it were not for the opposition of his captain, who was against him, because she had refused him certain favors which she could bestow only upon her husband. She handed me some certificates, and begged me to write a petition which she would present herself to the Secretary of War, adding that she could only offer me her heart in payment. I answered that her heart ought not to go alone. I acted as I had spoken, and I met with no other resistance than the objection which a pretty woman is always sure to feign for the sake of appearance. After that I told her to come back at noon, and that the petition would be ready. She was exact to the appointment, and very kindly rewarded me a second time, and in the evening, under pretense of some alterations to be made in the petition, she afforded an excellent opportunity of reaping a third recompense. But alas, the path of pleasure is not strewn only with roses. On the 3rd day I found out, much to my dismay, that a serpent had been hid under the flowers. 6 weeks of care and of rigid diet re-established my health. When I met the handsome Greek again, I was foolish enough to reproach her for the present she had bestowed upon me, but she baffled me by laughing, and saying that she had only offered me what she possessed, and that it was my own fault if I had not been sufficiently careful. The reader cannot imagine how much this first misfortune grieved me, and what deep shame I felt. I looked upon myself as a dishonored man, and while I am on that subject, I may as well relate an incident which will give some idea of my thoughtlessness. Madame Vida, the major's sister-in-law, being alone with me one morning, confided in me in a moment of unreserved confidence what she had to suffer from the jealous disposition of her husband, and his cruelty in having allowed her to sleep alone for the last 4 years, when she was in the very flower of her age. "I trust to God," she added, "that my husband will not find out that you have spent an hour alone with me, for I should never hear the end of it." Feeling deeply for her grief, and confidence begetting confidence, I was stupid enough to tell her the sad state to which I had been reduced by the cruel Greek woman, assuring her that I felt my misery all the more deeply, because I should have been delighted to console her, and to give her the opportunity of a revenge for her jealous husband's coldness. At this speech, in which my simplicity and good faith could easily be traced, she rose from her chair and upbraided me with every insult which an outraged honest woman might hurl at the head of a bold libertine who has presumed too far. Astounded, but understanding perfectly well the nature of my crime, I bowed myself out of her room; but as I was leaving it, she told me in the same angry tone that my visits would not be welcome for the future, as I was a conceited puppy, unworthy of the society of good and respectable women. I took care to answer that a respectable woman would have been rather more reserved than she had been in her confidences. On reflection, I felt pretty sure that, if I had been in good health, or had said nothing about my mishap, she would have been but too happy to receive my consolations. A few days after that incident I had a much greater cause to regret my acquaintance with the Greek woman. On Ascension Day, as the ceremony of the Bucin Tower was celebrated near the fort, M. Rosa brought Madame Orio and her two nieces to witness it, and I had the pleasure of treating them all to a good dinner in my room. I found myself, during the day, alone with my young friends in one of the casements, and they both loaded me with the most loving caresses and kisses. I felt that they expected some substantial proof of my love, but, to conceal the real state of things, I pretended to be afraid of being surprised, and they had to be satisfied with my shallow excuse. I had informed my mother by letter of all I had suffered from Grimani's treatment. She answered that she had written to him on the subject, that she had no doubt he would immediately set me at liberty, and that an arrangement had been entered into by which M. Grimani would devote the money raised by Rosetta from the sale of the furniture to the settlement of a small patrimony on my youngest brother. But in this matter Grimani did not act honestly, for the patrimony was only settled 13 years afterwards, and even then only in a fictitious manner. I shall have an opportunity later on of mentioning this unfortunate brother, who died very poor in Rome 20 years ago. Towards the middle of June the Cimmariotes were sent back to the east, and after their departure the garrison of the fort was reduced to its usual number. I began to feel weary in this comparative solitude, and I gave way to terrible fits of passion. The heat was intense, and so disagreeable to me that I wrote to M. Grimani, asking for 2 summer suits of clothes, and telling him where they would be found, if Rosetta had not sold them. A week afterwards I was in the major's apartment, when I saw the wretch Rosetta come in, accompanied by a man whom he introduced as Petrillo, the celebrated favorite of the Empress of Russia, just arrived from St. Petersburg. He ought to have said infamous instead of celebrated, and clown instead of favorite. The major invited them to take a seat, and Rosetta, receiving a parcel from Grimani's gondolier, handed it to me, saying, "I have brought you your rags, take them." I answered, "Some day I will bring you a regano." At these words the scoundrel dared to raise his cane, but the indignant major compelled him to lower his tone by asking him whether he had any wish to pass the night in the guardhouse. Petrillo, who had not yet opened his lips, told me then that he was sorry not to have found me in Venice, as I might have shown him round certain places which must be well known to me. "Very likely we should have met your wife in such places," I answered. "I am a good judge of faces," he said, "and I can see that you are a true gallows bird." I was trembling with rage, and the major, who shared my utter disgust, told them that he had business to transact, and they took their leave. The major assured me that on the following day he would go to the War Office to complain of Rosetta, and that he would have him punished for his insolence. I remained alone, a prey to feelings of the deepest indignation, and to a most ardent thirst for revenge. The fortress was entirely surrounded by water, and my windows were not overlooked by any of the sentinels. A boat coming under my windows could therefore easily take me to Venice during the night, and bring me back to the fortress before daybreak. All that was necessary was to find a boatman who, for a certain amount, would risk the galleys in case of discovery. Amongst several who brought provisions to the fort, I chose a boatman whose countenance pleased me, and I offered him 1 sequin. He promised to let me know his decision on the following day. He was true to his time, and declared himself ready to take me. He informed me that, before deciding to serve me, he had wished to know whether I was kept in the fort for any great crime, but as the wife of the major had told him that my imprisonment had been caused by very trifling frolics, I could rely upon him. We arranged that he should be under my window at the beginning of the night, and that his boat should be provided with a mast long enough to enable me to slide along it from the window to the boat. The appointed hour came, and everything being ready, I got safely into the boat, landed at the Sclavonian quay, ordered the boatman to wait for me, and wrapped up in a mariner's cloak, I took my way straight to the gate of Saint Sauveur, and engaged the waiter of a coffee room to take me to Rosetta's house. Being quite certain that he would not be at home at that time, I rang the bell, and I heard my sister's voice telling me that if I wanted to see him I must call in the morning. Satisfied with this, I went to the foot of the bridge and sat down, waiting there to see which way he would come, and a few minutes before midnight I saw him advancing from the square of St. Paul. It was all I wanted to know. I went back to my boat and returned to the fort without any difficulty. At 5 o'clock in the morning everyone in the garrison could see me enjoying my walk on the platform. Taking all the time necessary to mature my plans, I made the following arrangements to secure my revenge with perfect safety, and to prove an alibi in case I should kill my rascally enemy, as it was my intention to do. The day preceding the night fixed for my expedition, I walked about with the son of the adjutant Zen, who was only 12 years old, but who amused me much by his shrewdness. The reader will meet him again in the year 1771. As I was walking with him, I jumped down from one of the bastions, and feigned to sprain my ankle. 2 soldiers carried me to my room, and the surgeon of the fort, thinking that I was suffering from a luxation, ordered me to keep to bed, and wrapped up the ankle in towels saturated with camphorated spirits of wine. Everybody came to see me, and I requested the soldier who served me to remain and to sleep in my room. I knew that a glass of brandy was enough to stupefy the man, and to make him sleep soundly. As soon as I saw him fast asleep, I begged the surgeon and the chaplain, who had his room over mine, to leave me, and at 10:30 I lowered myself in the boat. As soon as I reached Venice, I bought a stout cudgel, and I sat myself down on a doorstep at the corner of the street near St. Paul's Square. A narrow canal at the end of the street was, I thought, the very place to throw my enemy in. That canal has now disappeared. At 12:15, I see Rosetta walking along leisurely. I come out of the street with rapid strides, keeping near the wall to compel him to make room for me, and I strike a first blow on the head, and a second on his arm. The third blow sends him tumbling in the canal, howling and screaming my name. At the same instant a Forlan, or citizen of Forli, comes out of a house on my left side with a lantern in his hand. A blow from my cudgel knocks the lantern out of his grasp, and the man, frightened out of his wits, takes to his heels. I throw away my stick, I run at full speed through the square and over the bridge, and while people are hastening towards the spot where the disturbance had taken place, I jump into the boat, and, thanks to a strong breeze swelling our sail, I get back to the fortress. 12 o'clock was striking as I re-entered my room through the window. I quickly undress myself, and the moment I am in my bed I wake up the soldier by my loud screams, telling him to go for the surgeon, as I am dying of the colic. The chaplain, roused by my screaming, comes down and finds me in convulsions. In the hope that some diascordium would relieve me, the good old man runs to his room and brings it. But while he has gone for some water, I hide the medicine. After half an hour of wry faces, I say that I feel much better, and thanking all my friends, I beg them to retire, which everyone does, wishing me a quiet sleep. The next morning I could not get up in consequence of my sprained ankle, although I had slept very well. The major was kind enough to call upon me before going to Venice, and he said that very likely my colic had been caused by the melon I had eaten for my dinner the day before. The major returned at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. "I have good news to give you," he said to me with a joyful laugh. "Rosetta was soundly cudgeled last night and thrown into a canal." "Has he been killed?" "No, but I am glad of it for your sake, for his death would make your position much more serious. You are accused of having done it." "I am very glad people think me guilty. It is something of a revenge, but it will be rather difficult to bring it home to me." "Very difficult. All the same, Rosetta swears he recognized you, and the same declaration is made by the Forlan, who says that you struck his hand to make him drop his lantern. Rosetta's nose is broken, 3 of his teeth are gone, and his right arm is severely hurt. You've been accused before the Avogador, and M. Grimani has written to the War Office to complain of your release from the fortress without his knowledge. I arrived at the office just in time. The secretary was reading Grimani's letter, and I assured his Excellency that it was a false report, for I left you in bed this morning, suffering from a sprained ankle. I told him likewise that at 12 o'clock last night you were very near death from a severe attack of colic." "Was it at midnight that Rosetta was so well treated?" "So says the official report. The War Secretary wrote at once to M. Grimani and informed him that you have not left the fort, and that you are even now detained in it, and that the plaintiff is at liberty, if he chooses, to send commissaries to ascertain the fact. Therefore, my dear Abbé, you must prepare yourself for an interrogatory." "I expect it, and I will answer that I am very sorry to be innocent." 3 days afterwards a commissary came to the fort with a clerk of the court, and the proceedings were soon over. Everybody knew that I had sprained my ankle. The chaplain, the surgeon, my body servant, and several others swore that at midnight I was in bed suffering from colic. My alibi being thoroughly proved, the Avogador sentenced Rosetta and the Forlan to pay all expenses, without prejudice to my rights of action. After this judgment, the major advised me to address to the Secretary of War a petition which he undertook to deliver himself, and to claim my release from the fort. I gave notice of my proceedings to M. Grimani, and a week afterwards the major told me that I was free, and that he would himself take me to the abbey. It was at dinner time, and in the middle of some amusing conversation, that he imparted that piece of information. Not supposing him to be in earnest, and in order to keep up the joke, I told him very politely that I preferred his house to Venice, and that, to prove it, I would be happy to remain a week longer, if he would grant me permission to do so. I was taken at my word, and everybody seemed very pleased. But when, 2 hours later, the news was confirmed, and I could no longer doubt the truth of my release, I repented the week which I had so foolishly thrown away as a present to the major. Yet I had not the courage to break my word, for everybody, and particularly his wife, had shown such unaffected pleasure, it would have been contemptible of me to change my mind. The good woman knew that I owed her every kindness which I had enjoyed, and she might have thought me ungrateful. But I met in the fort with a last adventure, which I must not forget to relate. On the following day, an officer, dressed in the national uniform, called upon the major, accompanied by an elderly man of about 60 years of age, wearing a sword, and, presenting to the major a dispatch with the seal of the War Office, he waited for an answer, and went away as soon as he had received one from the governor. After the officer had taken leave, the major, addressing himself to the elderly gentleman, to whom he gave the title of Count, told him that his orders were to keep him a prisoner, and that he gave him the whole of the fort for his prison. The Count offered him his sword, but the major nobly refused to take it, and escorted him to the room he was to occupy. Soon after, a servant in livery brought a bed and a trunk, and the next morning the same servant, knocking at my door, told me that his master begged the honor of my company to breakfast. I accepted the invitation, and he received me with these words: "Dear sir, there has been so much talk in Venice about the skill with which you proved your incredible alibi, that I could not help asking for the honor of your acquaintance." "But, Count, the alibi being a true one, there can be no skill required to prove it. Allow me to say that those who doubt its truth are paying me a very poor compliment, for never mind, do not let us talk any more of that, and forgive me. But as we happen to be companions in misfortune, I trust you will not refuse me your friendship. Now for breakfast." After our meal, the Count, who had heard from me some portion of my history, thought that my confidence called for a return on his part, and he began: "I am the Count de Bonafide. In my early days I served under Prince Eugene, but I gave up the army, and entered on a civil career in Austria. I had to fly from Austria and take refuge in Bavaria in consequence of an unfortunate duel. In Munich I made the acquaintance of a young lady belonging to a noble family. I eloped with her and brought her to Venice, where we were married. I have now been 20 years in Venice. I have 6 children, and everybody knows me. About a week ago I sent my servant to the post office for my letters, but they were refused him because he had not any money to pay the postage. I went myself, but the clerk would not deliver me my letters, although I assured him that I would pay for them the next time. This made me angry, and I called upon the Baron de Taxis, the postmaster, and complained of the clerk, but he answered very rudely that the clerk had simply obeyed his orders, and that my letters would only be delivered on payment of the postage. I felt very indignant, but as I was in his house I controlled my anger, went home, and wrote a note to him, asking him to give me satisfaction for his rudeness, telling him that I would never go out without my sword, and that I would force him to fight whenever and wherever I should meet him. I never came across him, but yesterday I was accosted by the secretary of the inquisitors, who told me that I must forget the baron's rude conduct, and go under the guidance of an officer whom he pointed out to me, to imprison myself for a week in this fortress. I shall thus have the pleasure of spending that time with you." I told him that I had been free for the last 24 hours, but that to show my gratitude for his friendly confidence I would feel honored if he would allow me to keep him company. As I had already engaged myself with the major, this was only a polite falsehood. End of chapter 7, part 1. Chapter 7, Part 2 of The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michelle Harris. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Episode 1, Childhood. Chapter 7, Part 2. In the afternoon I happened to be with him on the tower of the fort, and pointed out a gondola advancing towards the lower gate. He took his spy-glass and told me that it was his wife and daughter coming to see him. We went to meet the ladies, one of whom might once have been worth the trouble of an elopement. The other, a young person between 14 and 16, struck me as a beauty of a new style. Her hair was of a beautiful light auburn, her eyes were blue and very fine, her nose a Roman, and her pretty mouth, half open and laughing, exposed a set of teeth as white as her complexion, although a beautiful rosy tint somewhat veiled the whiteness of the last. Her figure was so slight that it seemed out of nature, but her perfectly formed breast appeared an altar on which the God of love would have delighted to breathe the sweetest incense. This splendid chest was, however, not yet well furnished, but in my imagination I gave her all the embonpoint which might have been desired, and I was so pleased that I could not take my looks from her. I met her eyes, and her laughing countenance seemed to say to me, "Only wait for 2 years, at the utmost, and all that your imagination is now creating will then exist in reality." She was elegantly dressed in the prevalent fashion, with large hoops, and like the daughters of the nobility who have not yet attained the age of puberty, although the young countess was marriageable. I had never dared to stare so openly at the bosom of a young lady of quality, but I thought there was no harm in fixing my eyes on a spot where there was nothing yet but in expectation. The count, after having exchanged a few words in German with his wife, presented me in the most flattering manner, and I was received with great politeness. The major joined us, deeming it his duty to escort the countess all over the fortress, and I improved the excellent opportunity thrown in my way by the inferiority of my position. I offered my arm to the young lady, and the count left us to go to his room. I was still an adept in the old Venetian fashion of attending upon ladies, and the young countess thought me rather awkward, though I believed myself very fashionable when I placed my hand under her arm, but she drew it back in high merriment. Her mother turned round to inquire what she was laughing at, and I was terribly confused when I heard her answer that I had tickled her. "This is the way to offer your arm to a lady," she said, and she passed her hand through my arm, which I rounded in the most clumsy manner, feeling it a very difficult task to resume a dignified countenance. Thinking me a novice of the most innocent species, she very likely determined to make sport of me. She began by remarking that by rounding my arm as I had done, I placed it too far from her waist, and that I was consequently out of drawing. I told her I did not know how to draw, and inquired whether it was one of her accomplishments. "I am learning," she answered, "and when you call upon us, I will show you Adam and Eve, after the Chevalier Liberi. I have made a copy which has been found very fine by some professors, although they did not know it was my work." "Why did you not tell them?" "Because those 2 figures are too naked." "I am not curious to see your Adam, but I will look at your Eve with pleasure, and keep your secret." This answer made her laugh again, and again her mother turned round. I put on the look of a simpleton, for, seeing the advantage I could derive from her opinion of me, I had formed my plan at the very moment she tried to teach me how to offer my arm to a lady. She was so convinced of my simplicity that she ventured to say that she considered her Adam by far more beautiful than her Eve, because in her drawing of the man she had omitted nothing, every muscle being visible, while there was none conspicuous in Eve. "It is," she added, "a figure with nothing in it." "Yet it is the one which I shall like best." "No, believe me, Adam will please you most." This conversation had greatly excited me. I had on a pair of linen breeches, the weather being very warm. I was afraid of the major and the countess, who were a few yards in front of us, turning round. I was on thorns. To make matters worse, the young lady stumbled, one of her shoes slipped off, and presenting me her pretty foot, she asked me to put the shoe right. I knelt on the ground, and, very likely without thinking, she lifted up her skirt. She had very wide hoops and no petticoat. What I saw was enough to strike me dead on the spot. When I rose, she asked if anything was the matter with me. A moment after, coming out of one of the casemates, her head dress got slightly out of order, and she begged that I would remedy the accident. But, having to bend her head down, the state in which I was could no longer remain a secret for her. In order to avoid greater confusion to both of us, she inquired who had made my watch ribbon. I told her it was a present from my sister, and she desired to examine it. but when I answered her that it was fastened to the fob pocket, and found that she disbelieved me, I added that she could see for herself. She put her hand to it, and a natural but involuntary excitement caused me to be very indiscreet. She must have felt vexed, for she saw that she had made a mistake in her estimate of my character. She became more timid, she would not laugh any more, and we joined her mother and the major, who was showing her, in a sentry box, the body of Marshal de Schulenburg, which had been deposited there until the mausoleum erected for him was completed. As for myself, I felt deeply ashamed. I thought myself the first man who had alarmed her innocence, and I felt ready to do anything to atone for the insult. Such was my delicacy of feeling in those days. I used to credit people with exalted sentiments, which often existed only in my imagination. I must confess that time has entirely destroyed that delicacy, yet I do not believe myself worse than other men, my equals in age and in experience. We returned to the Count's apartment, and the day passed off rather gloomily. Towards evening the ladies went away, but the Countess gave me a pressing invitation to call upon them in Venice. The young lady, whom I thought I had insulted, had made such a deep impression upon me that the 7 following days seemed very long. Yet I was impatient to see her again, only that I might entreat her forgiveness, and convince her of my repentance. The following day the Count was visited by his son. He was plain-featured, but a thorough gentleman, and modest withal. 25 years afterwards I met him in Spain, a cadet in the King's bodyguard. He had served as a private 20 years before obtaining this poor promotion. The reader will hear of him in good time. I will only mention here that when I met him in Spain, he stood me out that I had never known him. His self-love prompted this very contemptible lie. Early on the 8th day the Count left the fortress, and I took my departure the same evening, having made an appointment at a coffee house in St. Mark's Square with the major, who was to accompany me to M. Grimani's house. I took leave of his wife, whose memory will always be dear to me, and she said, "I thank you for your skill in proving your alibi, but you have also to thank me for having understood you so well. My husband never heard anything about it until it was all over." As soon as I reached Venice, I went to pay a visit to Madame Orio, where I was made welcome. I remained to supper, and my 2 charming sweethearts, who were praying for the death of the bishop, gave me the most delightful hospitality for the night. At noon the next day I met the major according to our appointment, and we called upon the Abbé Grimani. He received me with the air of a guilty man begging for mercy, and I was astounded at his stupidity when he entreated me to forgive Rosetta and his companion. He told me that the bishop was expected very soon, and that he had ordered a room to be ready for me, and that I could take my meals with him. Then he introduced me to M. Valavero, a man of talent, who had just left the Ministry of War, his term of office having lasted the usual 6 months. I paid my duty to him, and we kept up a kind of desultory conversation until the departure of the major. When he had left us, M. Valavero entreated me to confess that I had been the guilty party in the attack upon Rosetta. I candidly told him that the thrashing had been my handiwork, and I gave him all the particulars, which amused him immensely. He remarked that, as I had perpetrated the affair before midnight, the fools had made a mistake in their accusation, but that, after all, the mistake had not materially helped me in proving the alibi, because my sprained ankle, which everybody had supposed a real accident, would of itself have been sufficient. But I trust that my kind reader has not forgotten that I had a very heavy weight upon my conscience, of which I longed to get rid. I had to see the goddess of my fancy, to obtain my pardon or die at her feet. I found the house without difficulty. The Count was not at home. The Countess received me very kindly, but her appearance caused me so great a surprise that I did not know what to say to her. I had fancied that I was going to visit an angel, that I would find her in a lovely paradise, and I found myself in a large sitting room furnished with 4 rickety chairs and a dirty old table. There was hardly any light in the room because the shutters were nearly closed. It might have been a precaution against the heat, but I judged that it was more probably for the purpose of concealing the windows, the glass of which was all broken. But this visible darkness did not prevent me from remarking that the countess was wrapped up in an old tattered gown, and that her chemise did not shine by its cleanliness. Seeing that I was ill at ease, she left the room, saying that she would send her daughter, who, a few minutes afterwards, came in with an easy and noble appearance, and told me that she had expected me with great impatience, but that I had surprised her at a time at which she was not in the habit of receiving any visits. I did not know what to answer, for she did not seem to me to be the same person. Her miserable dishabille made her look almost ugly, and I wondered at the impression she had produced upon me at the fortress. She saw my surprise, and partly guessed my thoughts, for she put on a look, not of vexation, but of sorrow, which called forth all my pity. If she had been a philosopher, she might have rightly despised me as a man whose sympathy was enlisted only by her fine dress, her nobility, or her apparent wealth. But she endeavored to bring me round by her sincerity. She felt that if she could call a little sentiment into play, it would certainly plead in her favor. "I see that you are astonished, reverend sir, and I know the reason of your surprise. You expected to see great splendor here, and you find only misery. The government allows my father but a small salary, and there are 9 of us. As we must attend church on Sundays and holidays, in a style proper to our condition, we are often compelled to go without our dinner, in order to get out of pledge the clothes which urgent need too often obliges us to part with, and which we pledge anew on the following day. If we did not attend mass, the curate would strike our names off the list of those who share the alms of the confraternity of the poor, and those alms alone keep us afloat." What a sad tale! She had guessed rightly. I was touched, but rather with shame than true emotion. I was not rich myself, and, as I was no longer in love, I only heaved a deep sigh, and remained as cold as ice. Nevertheless, her position was painful, and I answered politely, speaking with kindness, and assuring her of my sympathy. "Were I wealthy," I said, "I would soon show you that your tale of woe has not fallen on unfeeling ears. But I am poor, and being at the eve of my departure from Venice, even my friendship would be useless to you." Then, after some desultory talk, I expressed a hope that her beauty would yet win happiness for her. She seemed to consider for a few minutes, and said, "That may happen some day, provided that the man who feels the power of my charms understands that they can be bestowed only with my heart, and is willing to render me the justice I deserve. I am only looking for a lawful marriage, without dreaming of rank or fortune. I no longer believe in the first, and I know how to live without the second, for I have been accustomed to poverty, and even to abject need, but you cannot realize that. Come and see my drawings." "You are very good, mademoiselle." Alas, I was not thinking of her drawings, and I could no longer feel interested in her Eve, but I followed her. We came to a chamber in which I saw a table, a chair, a small toilet glass, and a bed with the straw palliasse turned over, very likely for the purpose of allowing the looker on to suppose that there were sheets underneath. But I was particularly disgusted by a certain smell, the cause of which was recent. I was thunderstruck, and if I had been still in love, this antidote would have been sufficiently powerful to cure me instantly. I wished for nothing but to make my escape, never to return, and I regretted that I could not throw on the table a handful of ducats, which I should have considered the price of my ransom. The poor girl showed me her drawings. They were fine, and I praised them, without alluding particularly to Eve, and without venturing a joke upon Adam. I asked her, for the sake of saying something, why she did not try to render her talent remunerative by learning pastel drawing. "I wish I could," she answered, "but the box of chalks alone costs 2 sequins." "Will you forgive me if I am bold enough to offer you 6?" "Alas, I accept them gratefully, and to be indebted to you for such a service makes me truly happy." Unable to keep back her tears, she turned her head round to conceal them from me, and I took that opportunity of laying the money on the table, and out of politeness, wishing to spare her every unnecessary humiliation, I saluted her lips with a kiss which she was at liberty to consider a loving one, as I wanted her to ascribe my reserve to the respect I felt for her. I then left her with a promise to call another day to see her father. I never kept my promise. The reader will see how I met her again after 10 years. How many thoughts crowded upon my mind as I left that house! What a lesson! I compared reality with the imagination, and I had to give the preference to the last, as reality is always dependent on it. I then began to foresee a truth which has been clearly proved to me in my after life, namely, that love is only a feeling of curiosity, more or less intense, grafted upon the inclination placed in us by nature that the species may be preserved. And truly, woman is like a book, which, good or bad, must at first please us by the frontispiece. If this is not interesting, we do not feel any wish to read the book, and our wish is in direct proportion to the interest we feel. The frontispiece of woman runs from top to bottom like that of a book, and her feet, which are most important to every man who shares my taste, offer the same interest as the edition of the work. If it is true that most amateurs bestow little or no attention upon the feet of a woman, it is likewise a fact that most readers care little or nothing whether a book is of the first edition or the 10th. At all events, women are quite right to take the greatest care of their face, of their dress, of their general appearance, for it is only by that part of the frontispiece that they can call forth a wish to read them in those men who have not been endowed by nature with the privilege of blindness. And just in the same manner that men, who have read a great many books, are certain to feel at last a desire for perusing new works, even if they are bad, a man who has known many women, and all handsome women, feels at last a curiosity for ugly specimens when he meets with entirely new ones. It is all very well for his eye to discover the paint which conceals the reality, but his passion has become a vice, and suggests some argument in favor of the lying frontispiece. It is possible, at least he thinks so, that the work may prove better than the title page, and the reality more acceptable than the paint which hides it. He then tries to peruse the book, but the leaves have not been opened. He meets with some resistance. The living book must be read according to established rules, and the bookworm falls a victim to a coquetry, the monster which persecutes all those who make a business of love. As for thee, intelligent man, who hast read the few preceding lines, let me tell thee that, if they do not assist in opening thy eyes, thou art lost. I mean that thou art certain of being a victim to the fair sex, to the very last moment of thy life. If my candor does not displease thee, accept my congratulations. In the evening I called upon Madame Orio, as I wanted to inform her charming nieces that, being an inmate of Grimani's house, I could not sleep out for the first night. I found there the faithful Rosa, who told me that the affair of the alibi was in every mouth, and that, as such celebrity was evidently caused by a very decided belief in the untruth of the alibi itself, I ought to fear a retaliation of the same sort on the part of Rosetta, and to keep on my guard, particularly at night. I felt all the importance of this advice, and I took care never to go out in the evening otherwise than in a gondola, or accompanied by some friends. Madame Manzoni told me that I was acting wisely, because, although the judges could not do otherwise than acquit me, everybody knew the real truth of the matter, and Rosetta could not fail to be my deadly foe. 3 or 4 days afterwards M. Grimani announced the arrival of the bishop, who had put up at the convent of his order at St. Francois du Paul. He presented me himself to the prelate as a jewel highly prized by himself, and as if he had been the only person worthy of descanting upon its beauty. I saw a fine monk wearing his pectoral cross. He would have reminded me of Father Mancia if he had not looked stouter and less reserved. He was about 34, and had been made a bishop by the grace of God, the Holy See, and my mother. After pronouncing over me a blessing, which I received kneeling, and giving me his hand to kiss, he embraced me warmly, calling me his dear son in the Latin language, in which he continued to address me. I thought that, being a Calabrian, he might feel ashamed of his Italian, but he undeceived me by speaking in that language to M. Grimani. He told me that, as he could not take me with him from Venice, I should have to proceed to Rome, where Grimani would take care to send me, and that I would procure his address at Ancona from one of his friends, called Lazzari, a Minim monk, who would likewise supply me with the means of continuing my journey. "When we meet in Rome," he added, "we can go together to Martorano by way of Naples. Call upon me tomorrow morning and have your breakfast with me. I intend to leave the day after." As we were on our way back to his house, M. Grimani treated me to a long lecture on morals, which nearly caused me to burst into loud laughter. Amongst other things, he informed me that I ought not to study too hard, because the air in Calabria was very heavy, and I might become consumptive from too close application to my books. The next morning at daybreak I went to the bishop. After saying his mass, we took some chocolate, and for 3 hours he laid me under examination. I saw clearly that he was not pleased with me, but I was well enough pleased with him. He seemed to me a worthy man, and, as he was to lead me along the great highway of the church, I felt attracted towards him, for, at the time, although I entertained a good opinion of my personal appearance, I had no confidence whatever in my talents. After the departure of the good bishop, M. Grimani gave me a letter left by him, which I was to deliver to Father Lazzari at the convent of the Minims in Ancona. M. Grimani informed me that he would send me to that city with the ambassador from Venice, who was on the point of sailing. I had therefore to keep myself in readiness, and, as I was anxious to be out of his hands, I approved all his arrangements. As soon as I had notice of the day on which the suite of the ambassador would embark, I went to pay my last farewell to all my acquaintances. I left my brother Francois in the school of M. Joly, a celebrated decorative painter. As the peotta in which I was to sail would not leave before daybreak, I spent the short night in the arms of the 2 sisters, who, this time, entertained no hope of ever seeing me again. On my side, I could not foresee what would happen, for I was abandoning myself to fate, and I thought it would be useless to think of the future. The night was therefore spent between joy and sadness, between pleasures and tears. As I bade them adieu, I returned the key which had opened so often for me the road to happiness. This, my first love affair, did not give me any experience of the world, for our intercourse was always a happy one, and was never disturbed by any quarrel or stained by any interested motive. We often felt, all 3 of us, as if we must raise our souls towards the eternal providence of God, to thank Him for having, by His particular protection, kept from us all the accidents which might have disturbed the sweet peace we were enjoying. I left in the hands of Madame Manzoni all my papers and all the forbidden books I possessed. The good woman, who was 20 years older than I, and who, believing in an immutable destiny, took pleasure in turning the leaves of the great book of fate, told me that she was certain of restoring to me all I left with her before the end of the following year at the latest. Her prediction caused me both surprise and pleasure, and feeling deep reverence for her, I thought myself bound to assist the realization of her foresight. After all, if she predicted the future, it was not through superstition, or in consequence of some vain foreboding which reason must condemn, but through her knowledge of the world and of the nature of the person she was addressing. She used to laugh because she never made a mistake. I embarked from St. Mark's Landing. M. Grimani had given me 10 sequins, which he thought would keep me during my stay in the lazaretto of Ancona for the necessary quarantine, after which it was not to be supposed that I could want any money. I shared Grimani's certainty on the subject, and with my natural thoughtlessness I cared nothing about it. Yet I must say that, unknown to everybody, I had in my purse 40 bright sequins, which powerfully contributed to increase my cheerfulness, and I left Venice full of joy and without one regret. End of chapter 7, part 2.
Chapter 8 of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Episode 2, Cleric in Naples. Chapter 8. The retinue of the ambassador, which was styled grand, appeared to me very small. It was composed of a Milanese steward named Carcinelli, of a priest who fulfilled the duties of secretary because he could not write, of an old woman acting as housekeeper, of a man cook with his ugly wife, and 8 or 10 servants. We reached Chiozza about noon. Immediately after landing, I politely asked the steward where I should put up, and his answer was, "Wherever you please, provided you let this man know where it is, so that he can give you notice when the peotta is ready to sell. My duty," he added, "is to leave you at the lazaretto of Ancona, free of expense from the moment we leave this place. Until then, enjoy yourself as well you can." The man to whom I was to give my address was the captain of the peotta. I asked him to recommend me a lodging. "You may come to my house," he said, "if you have no objection to share a large bed with the cook, whose wife remains on board." Unable to devise any better plan, I accepted the offer, and the sailor, carrying my trunk, accompanied me to the dwelling of the honest captain. My trunk had to be placed under the bed, which filled up the room. I was amused at this, for I was not in a position to be over fastidious, and after partaking of some dinner at the inn, I went about the town. Chiozza is a peninsula, a seaport belonging to Venice, with a population of 10,000 inhabitants, seamen, fishermen, merchants, lawyers, and government clerks. I entered a coffee-room, and I had scarcely taken a seat when a young doctor-at-law, with whom I had studied in Padua, came up to me, and introduced me to a druggist whose shop was near by, saying that his house was the rendezvous of all the literary men of the place. A few minutes afterwards, a tall Jacobin friar, blind of one eye, called Corsini, whom I had known in Venice, came in and paid me many compliments. He told me that I had arrived just in time to go to a picnic got up by the macaronic academicians for the next day, after a sitting of the academy in which every member was to recite something of his composition. He invited me to join them, and to gratify the meeting with the delivery of one of my productions. I accepted the invitation, and, after the reading of 10 stanzas, which I had written for the occasion, I was unanimously elected a member. My success at the picnic was still greater, for I disposed of such a quantity of macaroni that I was found worthy of the title of Prince of the Academy. The young doctor, himself one of the academicians, introduced me to his family. His parents, who were in easy circumstances, received me very kindly. One of his sisters was very amiable, but the other, a professed nun, appeared to me a prodigy of beauty. I might have enjoyed myself in a very agreeable way in the midst of that charming family during my stay in Chiozza, but I suppose that it was my destiny to meet in that place with nothing but sorrows. The young doctor forewarned me that the monk Corsini was a very worthless fellow, despised by everybody, and advised me to avoid him. I thanked him for the information, but my thoughtlessness prevented me from profiting by it. Of a very easy disposition, and too giddy to fear any snares, I was foolish enough to believe that the monk would, on the contrary, be the very man to throw plenty of amusement in my way. On the third day, the worthless dog took me to a house of ill fame, where I might have gone without his introduction, and in order to shew my mettle, I obliged a low creature whose ugliness ought to have been a sufficient antidote against any fleshy desire. On leaving the place, he brought me for supper to an inn, where we met 4 scoundrels of his own stamp. After supper, one of them began a bank of faro, and I was invited to join in the game. I gave way to that feeling of false pride which so often causes the ruin of young men, and after losing 4 sequins, I expressed the wish to retire, but my honest friend, the Jacobin, contrived to make me risk 4 more sequins in partnership with him. He held the bank, and it was broken. I did not wish to play any more, but Corsini, feigning to pity me and to feel great sorrow at being the cause of my loss, induced me to try myself a bank of 25 sequins. My bank was likewise broken. The hope of winning back my money made me keep up the game, and I lost everything I had. Deeply grieved, I went away and laid myself down near the cook, who woke up and said I was a libertine. "You're right," was all I could answer. I was worn out with fatigue and sorrow, and I slept soundly. My vile tormentor, the monk, woke me at noon, and informed me with a triumphant joy that a very rich young man had been invited by his friends to supper, that he would be sure to play and lose, and that it would be a good opportunity for me to retrieve my losses. "I have lost all my money. Lend me 20 sequins." "When I lend the money I am sure to lose. You may call it superstitious, but I have tried it too often. Try to find money somewhere else and come. Farewell." I felt ashamed to confess my position to my friend, and sending for a money-lender, I emptied my trunk before him. We made an inventory of my clothes, and the honest broker gave me 30 sequins, with the understanding that if I did not redeem them within 3 days, all my things would become his property. I am bound to call him an honest man, for he advised me to keep 3 shirts, a few pair of stockings, and a few handkerchiefs. I was disposed to let him take everything, having a presentiment that I would win back all I had lost, a very common error. A few years later, I took my revenge by writing a diatribe against presentiments. I am of opinion that the only foreboding in which man can have of any sort of faith is the one which forebodes evil, because it comes from the mind, while a presentiment of happiness has its origin in the heart, and the heart is a fool worthy of reckoning foolishly upon fickle fortune. I did not lose any time in joining the honest company, which was alarmed at the thought of not seeing me. Supper went off without any allusion to gambling, but my admirable qualities were highly praised, and it was decided that a brilliant fortune awaited me in Rome. After supper there was no talk of play, but giving way to my evil genius, I loudly asked for my revenge. I was told that if I would take the bank, everyone would punt. I took the bank, lost every sequin I had, and retired, begging the monk to pay what I owed to the landlord, which he promised to do. I was in despair, and to crown my misery, I found out, as I was going home, that I had met the day before with another living specimen of the Greek woman, less beautiful, but as perfidious. I went to bed stunned by my grief, and I believe that I must have fainted into a heavy sleep, which lasted 11 hours. My awaking was that of a miserable being, hating the light of heaven, of which he felt himself unworthy, and I closed my eyes again, trying to sleep for a little while longer. I dreaded to rouse myself up entirely, knowing that I would then have to take some decision, but I never once thought of returning to Venice, which would have been the very best thing to do, and I would have destroyed myself rather than confide my sad position to the young doctor. I was weary of my existence, and I entertained vaguely some hope of starving where I was, without leaving my bed. It is certain that I should not have got up, if Mr. Alban, the master of the peotta, had not roused me by calling upon me and informing me that the boat was ready to sail. The man who is delivered from great perplexity, no matter by what means, feels himself relieved. It seemed to me that Captain Alban had come to point out the only thing I could possibly do. I dressed myself in haste, and tying all my worldly possessions in a handkerchief, I went on board. Soon afterwards we left the shore, and in the morning we cast anchor in Orsara, a seaport of Istria. We all landed to visit the city, which would more properly be called a village. It belongs to the Pope, the Republic of Venice having abandoned it to the Holy See. A young monk of the Order of the Recollects, who called himself Friar Stefano of Bellun, and had obtained a free passage from the devout Captain Alban, joined me as we landed and inquired whether I felt sick. "Reverend Father, I am unhappy." "You will forget all your sorrow if you will come and dine with me at the house of one of our devout friends." I had not broken my fast for 36 hours, and having suffered much from sea-sickness during the night, my stomach was quite empty. My erotic inconvenience made me very uncomfortable. My mind felt deeply the consciousness of my degradation, and I did not possess a groat. I was in such a miserable state that I had no strength to accept or to refuse anything. I was thoroughly torpid, and I followed the monk mechanically. He presented me to a lady, saying that he was accompanying me to Rome, where I intend to become a Franciscan. This untruth disgusted me, and under any other circumstance I would not have let it pass without protest, but in my actual position it struck me as rather comical. The good lady gave us a good dinner of fish cooked in oil, which in Orsara is delicious, and we drank some exquisite refosco. During our meal, a priest happened to drop in, and after a short conversation, he told me that I ought not pass the night on board the tartan, and pressed me to accept a bed in his house and a good dinner for the next day, in case the wind should not allow us to sail. I accepted without hesitation. I offered my most sincere thanks to the good old lady, and the priest took me all over the town. In the evening, he brought me to his house, where we partook of an excellent supper prepared by his housekeeper, who sat down to the table with us, and with whom I was much pleased. The refosco, still better than that which I had drunk at dinner, scattered all my misery to the wind, and I conversed gaily with the priest. He offered to read to me a poem of his own composition, but feeling that my eyes would not keep open, I begged he would excuse me and postpone the reading until the following day. I went to bed, and in the morning after 10 hours of the most profound sleep, the housekeeper, who had been watching for my awakening, brought me some coffee. I thought her a charming woman, but alas, I was not in a fit state to prove to her the high estimation in which I held her beauty. Entertaining feelings of gratitude for my kind host, and disposed to listen attentively to his poem, I dismissed all sadness, and I paid his poetry such compliments that he was delighted, and, finding me much more talented than he had judged me to be at first, he insisted upon treating me to a reading of his idylls, and I had to swallow them, bearing the infliction cheerfully. The day passed off very agreeably. The housekeeper surrounded me with the kindest attentions, a proof that she was smitten with me, and giving way to that pleasing idea, I felt that, by a very natural system of reciprocity, she had made my conquest. The good priest thought that the day had passed like lightning, thanks to all the beauties that I had discovered in his poetry, which, to speak the truth, was below mediocrity, but time seemed to me to drag along very slowly, because the friendly glances of the housekeeper made me long for bedtime, in spite of the miserable condition in which I felt myself morally and physically. But such was my nature. I abandoned myself to joy and happiness, when, had I been more reasonable, I ought to have sunk under my grief and sadness. But the golden time came at last. I found the pretty housekeeper full of compliance, but only up to a certain point, and as she offered some resistance when I shewed myself disposed to pay a full homage to her charms, I quietly gave up the undertaking, very well pleased for both of us that it had not been carried any further, and I sought my couch in peace. But I had not seen the end of the adventure, for the next morning, when she brought my coffee, her pretty, enticing manners allured me to bestow a few loving caresses upon her, and if she did not abandon herself entirely, it was only, as she said, because she was afraid of some surprise. The day passed off very pleasantly with the good priest, and at night, the housekeeper no longer fearing detection, and I having on my side taken every precaution necessary in the state in which I was, we passed 2 most delicious hours. I left Orsara the next morning. Friar Stephano amused me all day with his talk, which plainly showed me his ignorance combined with knavery under the veil of simplicity. He made me look at the alms he had received in Orsara: bread, wine, cheese, sausages, preserves, and chocolate. Every nook and cranny of his holy garment was full of provisions. "Have you received money likewise?" I inquired. "God forbid! In the first place, our glorious order does not permit me to touch money, and, in the second place, were I to be foolish enough to receive any when I am begging, people would think themselves quit of me with 1 or 2 sous, whilst they dive me 10 times as much in eatables. Believe me, St. Francis was a very judicious man." I bethought myself that what this monk called wealth would be poverty to me. He offered to share with me, and seemed very proud at my consenting to honour him so far. The tartan touched at the harbour of Pola, called Veruda, and we landed. After a walk up the hill of nearly a quarter of an hour, we entered the city, and I devoted a couple of hours to visiting the Roman antiquities, which are numerous, the town having been the metropolis of the empire. Yet I saw no other trace of grand buildings except the ruins of the arena. We returned to Veruda, and went again to sea. On the following day we sighted Ancona, but, the wind being against us, we were compelled to tack about, and we did not reach the port till the second day. The harbour of Ancona, although considered one of the great works of Trajan, would be very unsafe if it were not for a causeway which has cost a great deal of money, and which makes it somewhat better. I observed a fact worthy of notice, namely, that in the Adriatic the northern coast has many harbours, while the opposite coast can only boast one or two. It is evident that the sea is retiring by degrees towards the east, and what in 3 or 4 more centuries Venice must be joined to the land. We landed at the old lazaretto, where we received the pleasant information that we would go through a quarantine of 28 days, because Venice had admitted, after a quarantine of 3 months, the crew of 2 ships from Messina, where the plague had recently been raging. I requested a room for myself and for brother Stefano, who thanked me very heartily. I hired from a Jew a bed, a table, and a few chairs, promising to pay for the hire at the expiration of our quarantine. The monk would have nothing but straw. If he had guessed that without him I might have starved, he would most likely not have felt so much vanity at sharing my room. A sailor, expecting to find in me a generous customer, came to inquire where my trunk was, and hearing from me that I did not know, he, as well as Captain Alban, went to a great deal of trouble to find it, and I could hardly keep down my merriment when the captain called, begging to be excused for having left it behind, and assuring me that he would take care to forward it to me in less than 3 weeks. The friar, who had to remain with me 4 weeks, expected to live at my expense, while, on the contrary, he had been sent by Providence to keep me. He had provisions enough for 1 week, but it was necessary to think of the future. After supper, I drew a most affecting picture of my position, showing that I would be in need of everything until my arrival at Rome, where I was going, I said, to fill the post of Secretary of Memorials, and my astonishment may be imagined when I saw the blockhead delighted at the recital of my misfortunes. "I undertake to take care of you until we reach Rome. Only tell me whether you can write." "What a question! Are you joking?" "Why should I? Look at me. I cannot write anything but my name. True, I can write it with either hand, and what else do I want to know?" "You astonish me greatly, for I thought you were a priest." "I am a monk. I say the Mass, and, as a matter of course, I must know how to read. St. Francis, whose unworthy son I am, could not read, and that is the reason why he never said a Mass. But as you can write, you will tomorrow pen a letter in my name to the person whose name I will give you, and I warrant you we shall have enough sent here to live like fighting cocks all through our quarantine." The next day he made me write 8 letters, because, in the oral tradition of his order, it is said that when a monk has knocked at 7 doors, and has met with a refusal at every one of them, he must apply to the 8th with perfect confidence, because there he is certain of receiving alms. As he had already performed the pilgrimage to Rome, he knew every person in Ancona devoted to the cult of St. Francis, and was acquainted with the superiors of all the rich convents. I had to write to every person he named, and to set down all the lies he dictated to me. He likewise made me sign the letters for him, saying that, if he signed himself, his correspondents would see that the letters had not been written by him, which would injure him, for, he added, in this age of corruption, people will esteem only learned men. He compelled me to fill the letters with Latin passages and quotations, even those addressed to ladies, and I remonstrated in vain, for when I raised any objection, he threatened to leave me without anything to eat. I made up my mind to do exactly as he wished. He desired me to write to the superior of the Jesuits that he would not apply to the Capuchins, because they were no better than atheists, and that was the reason of the great dislike of St. Francis for them. It was in vain that I reminded him of the fact that in the time of St. Francis there were neither Capuchins nor Recollets. His answer was that I had proved myself an ignoramus. I firmly believed that he would be thought a madman, and that we should not receive anything, but I was mistaken, for such a quantity of provisions came pouring in that I was amazed. Wine was sent from 3 or 4 different quarters, more than enough for us during all our stay, and yet I drank nothing but water, so great was my wish to recover my health. As for eatables, enough was sent in every day for 6 persons. We gave all our surplus to our keeper, who had a large family, but the monk felt no gratitude for the kind souls who bestowed their charity upon him, and all his thanks were reserved for St. Francis. He undertook to have my men washed by the keeper. I would not have dared to give it myself, and he said that he had nothing to fear, as everybody was well aware that the monks of his order never wear any kind of linen. I kept myself in bed nearly all day, and thus avoided shewing myself to visitors. The persons who did not come wrote letters full of incongruities cleverly worded, which I took good care not to point out to him. It was with great difficulty that I tried to persuade him that those letters did not require an answer. A fortnight of repose and severe diet brought me round towards complete recovery, and I began to walk in the yard of the lazaretto from morning till night. But the arrival of a Turk from Thessalonia with his family compelled me to suspend my walks, the ground floor having been given to him. The only pleasure left me was to spend my time on the balcony overlooking the yard. I soon saw a Greek slave, a girl of dazzling beauty, for whom I felt the deepest interest. She was in the habit of spending the whole day sitting near the door with a book or some embroidery in her hand. If she happened to raise her eyes and to meet mine, she modestly bent her head down, and sometimes she rose and went in slowly, as if she meant to say, "I did not know that somebody was looking at me." Her figure was tall and slender. Her features proclaimed her to be very young. She had a very fair complexion, with beautiful black hair and eyes. She wore the Greek costume, which gave her person a certain air of very exciting voluptuousness. I was perfectly idle, and with the temperament which nature and habit had given me, was it likely that I could feast my eyes constantly upon such a charming object without falling desperately in love? I have heard her conversing in lingua franca with her master, a fine old man, who, like her, felt very weary of the quarantine, and used to come out but seldom, smoking his pipe, and remaining in the yard only a short time. I felt a great temptation to address a few words to the beautiful girl, but I was afraid she might run away and never come out again. However, unable to control myself any longer, I determined to write to her. I had no difficulty in conveying the letter, as I had only to let it fall from my balcony. But she might have refused to pick it up, and this is the plan I adopted in order not to risk any unpleasant result. Availing myself of a moment during which she was alone in the yard, I dropped from my balcony a small piece of paper folded like a letter, but had taken care not to write anything on it, and held the true letter in my hand. As soon as I saw her stooping down to pick up the first, I quickly let the second drop at her feet, and she put both into her pocket. A few minutes afterwards she left the yard. My letter was somewhat to this effect: "Beautiful angel from the east, I worship you. I will remain all night on this balcony, in the hope that you will come to me for a quarter of an hour, and listen to my voice through the hole under my feet. We can speak softly, and in order to hear me, you can climb up to the top of the bale of goods, which lies beneath the same hole. I begged from my keeper not to lock me in, as he did every night, and he consented on condition that he would watch me, for if I had jumped down in the yard, his life might have been the penalty, and he promised not to disturb me on the balcony. At midnight, as I was beginning to give her up, she came forward. Then I laid myself flat on the floor of the balcony, and I placed my head against the hole, about 6 inches square. I saw her jump on the bale, and her head reach within a foot from the balcony. She was compelled to steady herself with one hand against the wall for fear of falling, and in that position we talked of love, of ardent desires, of obstacles, of impossibilities, and of cunning artifices. I told her the reason for which I dared not jump down in the yard, and she observed that, even without that reason, it would bring ruin upon us, as it would be impossible to come up again, and that besides, God alone knew what her master would do if he were to find us together. Then, promising to visit me this way every night, she passed her hand through the hole. Alas, I could not leave off kissing it, for I thought that I had never in my life touched so soft, so delicate a hand. But what bliss when she begged for mine! I quickly thrust my arm through the hole, so that she could fasten her lips to the bend of the elbow. How many sweet liberties my hands ventured to take! But we were at last compelled by prudence to separate, and when I returned to my room, I saw with great pleasure that the keeper was fast asleep. Although I was delighted at having obtained every favour I could possibly wish for in the uncomfortable position we had been in, I racked my brain to contrive the means of securing more complete enjoyment for the following night, but I found during the afternoon that the feminine cunning of my beautiful Greek was more fertile than mine. Being alone in the yard with her master, she had a few words to him in Turkish, to which he seemed to give his approval, and soon after a servant, assisted by the keeper, brought under the balcony a large basket of goods. She overlooked the arrangement, and in order to secure the basket better, she made the servant place a bale of cotton across 2 others. Guessing at her purpose, I fairly leaped for joy, for she had found a way of raising herself 2 feet higher, but I thought that she would then find herself in the most inconvenient position, and that, forced to bend double, she would not be able to resist the fatigue. The hole was not wide enough for her head to pass through, otherwise she might have stood erect and been comfortable. It was necessary, at all events, to guard against that difficulty. The only way was to tear out one of the planks of the floor of the balcony, but it was not an easy undertaking. Yet I decided upon attempting it, regardless of the consequences, and I went to my room to provide myself with a large pair of pincers. Luckily the keeper was absent, and availing myself of the opportunity, I succeeded in dragging out carefully the 4 large nails which fastened the plank. Finding that I could lift it at my will, I replaced the pincers and waited for the night with amorous impatience. The darling girl came exactly at midnight. Noticing the difficulty she experienced in climbing up, and in getting a footing on the 3rd bale of cotton, I lifted the plank, and, extending my arm as far as I could, I offered her a steady point of support. She stood straight, and found herself agreeably surprised, for she could pass her head and her arms through the hole. We wasted no time in empty compliments. We only congratulated each other upon having both worked for the same purpose. If the night before I had found myself master of her person more than she was of mine, this time the position was entirely reversed. Her hand roamed freely over every part of my body, but I had to stop halfway down hers. She cursed the man who had packed her bale for not having made it half a foot bigger, so as to get nearer to me. Very likely, even that would have not satisfied us, but she would have felt happier. Our pleasures were barren, yet we kept up our enjoyment until the first streak of light. I put back the plank carefully, and I lay down in my bed in great need of recruiting my strength. My dear mistress had informed me that the Turkish Bayram began that very morning, and would last 3 days, during which it would be impossible for her to see me. The night after Bayram she did not fail to make her appearance, and, saying that she could not be happy without me, she told me that, as she was a Christian woman, I could buy her, if I waited for her after leaving the lazaretto. I was compelled to tell her that I did not possess the means of doing so, and my confession made her sigh. On the following night, she informed me that her master would sell her for 2,000 piastres, that she would give me the amount, and that she was yet a virgin, and that I would be pleased with my bargain. She added that she would give me a casket full of diamonds, one of which was alone worth 2,000 piastres, and that the sale of the others would place us beyond the reach of poverty for the remainder of our life. She assured me that her master would not notice the loss of the casket, and that, if he did, he would never think of accusing her. I was in love with that girl, and her proposal made me uncomfortable. But when I woke in the morning, I did not hesitate any longer. She brought the casket in the evening, but I told her that I never could make up my mind to be accessory to a robbery. She was very unhappy, and said that my love was not as deep as her own, but that she could not help admiring me for being so good a Christian.
End of Part A of Chapter 8. Chapter 8, Part B of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Episode 2, Cleric in Naples. Chapter 8, Part B.
This was the last night, probably we should never meet again. The flame of passion consumed us. She proposed that I should lift her up to the balcony through the open space. Where is the lover who would have objected to so attractive a proposal? I rose, and without being a Milo, I placed my hands under her arms. I drew her up towards me, and my desires are on the point of being fulfilled. Suddenly, I felt 2 hands upon my shoulders, and the voice of the keeper exclaimed, "What are you about?" I let my precious burden drop. She regains her chamber, and I, giving vent to my rage, throw myself flat on the floor of the balcony, and remain there without a movement, in spite of the shaking of the keeper, whom I was sorely tempted to strangle. At last, I rose from the floor, and went to bed without uttering one word, and not even caring to replace the plank. In the morning, the governor informed us that we were free. As I left the lazaretto, with a breaking heart, I caught a glimpse of the Greek slave drowned in tears. I agreed to meet Friar Stephano at the exchange, and I took the Jew from whom I had hired the furniture to the convent of the Minims, where I received from Father Lazari 10 sequins and the address of the bishop, who, after performing quarantine on the frontiers of Tuscany, had proceeded to Rome, where he would expect me to meet him. I paid the Jew, and made a poor dinner at an inn. As I was leaving it to join the monk, I was so unlucky as to meet Captain Alban, who reproached me bitterly for having led him to believe that my trunk had been left behind. I contrived to appease his anger by telling him all my misfortunes, and I signed a paper in which I declared that I had no claim whatsoever upon him. I then purchased a pair of shoes and an overcoat, and met Stefano, whom I informed of my decision to make a pilgrimage to Our Lady of Loreto. I said I would wait there for him, and that we would afterwards travel together as far as Rome. He answered that he did not wish to go through Loreto, and that I would repent of my contempt for the grace of St. Francis. He did not alter my mind, and I left for Loreto the next day in the enjoyment of perfect health. I reached the holy city, tired almost to death, for it was the first time in my life that I had walked 15 miles, drinking nothing but water, although the weather was very warm, because the dry wine used in that part of the country parched me too much. I must observe that, in spite of my poverty, I did not look like a beggar. As I was entering the city, I saw coming towards me an elderly priest of very respectable appearance, and, as he was evidently taking notice of me, as soon as he drew near, I saluted him, and inquired where I could find a comfortable inn. "I cannot doubt," he said, "that a person like you, travelling on foot, must come here from devout motives. Come with me." He turned back. I followed him, and he took me to a fine-looking house. After whispering a few words to a man who appeared to be a steward, he left me, saying very affably, "You shall be well attended to." My first impression was that I had been mistaken for some other person, but I said nothing. I was led to a suite of 3 rooms. The chamber was decorated with damask hangings. The bedstead had a canopy, and the table was supplied with all materials necessary for writing. A servant brought me a light dressing-gown, and another came in with linen and a large tub full of water, which he placed before me. My shoes and stockings were taken off, and my feet washed. A very decent-looking woman, followed by a servant-girl, came in a few minutes later, and curtsying very low, she proceeded to make my bed. At that moment the Angelus bell was heard. Everyone knelt down, and I followed their example. After the prayer, a small table was neatly laid out, and I was asked what sort of wine I wished to drink, and I was provided with newspapers and 2 silver candlesticks. An hour afterwards I had a delicious fish supper, and before I retired to bed, a servant came to inquire whether I would take chocolate in the morning before or after Mass. As soon as I was in bed, the servant brought me a night lamp with a dial, and I remained alone. Except in France, I have never had such a good bed as I had that night. It would have cured the most chronic insomnia, but I was not labouring under such a disease, and I slept for 10 hours. This sort of treatment easily led me to believe that I was not in any kind of hostelry. But where was I? How was I to suppose that I was in a hospital? When I had taken my chocolate, a hairdresser, quite a fashionable, dapper fellow, made his appearance, dying to give vent to his chattering propensities. Guessing that I did not wish to be shaved, he offered to clip myself down with the scissors, saying that I would look younger. Why do you suppose that I want to conceal my age? It is very natural, because if your lordship did not wish to do so, your lordship would have shaved long ago. Countess Marcolini is here. Does your lordship know her? I must go to her at noon to dress her hair. I did not feel interested in the Countess Marcolini, and seeing it, the gossip changed the subject. Is this your lordship's first visit to this house? It is the finest hospital throughout the Papal States. I quite agree with you, and I shall compliment His Holiness on the establishment. Oh, His Holiness knows all about it. He resided here before he became Pope. If Monsignor Caraffa had not been well acquainted with you, he would not have introduced you here. Such is the use of barbers throughout Europe, but you must not put any questions to them, for if you do,
they are sure to threat you to an impudent mixture of truth and falsehood, and instead of you pumping them, they will worm everything out of you." Thinking that it was my duty to present my respectful compliments to Monsignor Caraffa, I desired to be taken to his apartment. He gave me a pleasant welcome, showed me his library, and entrusted me to the care of one of his abbés, a man of parts, who acted as my cicerone everywhere. 20 years afterwards, this same abbé was of great service to me in Rome, and if still alive, he is a canon of St. John Lateran. On the following day, I took the communion in the Santa Casa. The third day was entirely employed in examining the exterior of this truly wonderful sanctuary, and early the next day I resumed my journey, having spent nothing except 3 paoli for the barber. Halfway to Macerata, I overtook Brother Stefano walking on at very slow rate. He was delighted to see me again, and told me that he had left Ancona 2 hours after me, but that he never walked more than 3 miles a day, being quite satisfied to take 2 months for a journey which, even on foot, can easily be accomplished in a week. "I want," he said, "to reach Rome without fatigue and in good health, and in no hurry. And if you feel disposed to travel with me, and in the same quiet way, St. Francis will not find it difficult to keep us both during the journey." This lazy fellow was a man about 30, red-haired, very strong and healthy, a true peasant who had turned himself into a monk only for the sake of living in idle comfort. I answered that, as I was in a hurry to reach Rome, I could not be his travelling companion. "I undertake to walk 6 miles instead of 3 today," he said, "if you carry my cloak, which I find very heavy." The proposal struck me as a rather funny one. I put on his cloak, and he took my greatcoat, but, after the exchange, we cut such a comical figure that every peasant we met laughed at us. His cloak would truly have proved a load for a mule. There were 12 pockets quite full, without taking into account a pocket behind, which he called il paticulo, and which contained, alone, twice as much as all the others. Bread, wine, fresh and salt meat, fowls, eggs, cheese, ham, sausages, everything was to be found in those pockets, which contained provisions enough for a fortnight. I told him how well I had been treated in Loretto, and he assured me that I might have asked Monsignor Caraffa to give me letters for all the hospitals on my road to Rome, and that everywhere I would have met with the same reception. The hospitals, he added, are all under the curse of St. Francis, because the mendicant friars are not admitted in them. But we do not mind their gates being shut against us, because they are too far apart from each other. We prefer the homes of the persons attached to our order. These we find everywhere. Why do you not ask hospitality in the convents of your order?" "I am not so foolish. In the first place, I should not be admitted, because, being a fugitive, I have not the written obedience which must be shown at every convent, and I should even run the risk of being thrown into prison. Your monks are a cursed bad lot. In the second place, I should not be half so comfortable in the convents as I am with our devout benefactors." "Why and how are you a fugitive?" He answered my question by the narrative of his imprisonment and flight, the whole story being a tissue of absurdities and lies. The fugitive Recollet friar was a fool, with something of the wit of Harlequin, and he thought that every man listening to him was a greater fool than himself. Yet, with all his folly, he was not bent in a certain species of cunning. His religious principles were singular. As he did not wish to be taken for a bigoted man, he was scandalous, and for the sake of making people laugh, he would often make use of the most disgusting expressions. He had no taste whatsoever for women, and no inclination towards the pleasures of the flesh, but this was only owing to a deficiency in his natural temperament. And yet he claimed for himself the virtue of continence. On that score, everything appeared to him food for merriment, and when he had drunk rather too much, he would ask questions of such an indecent character that it would bring blushes on everybody's countenance. Yet the brute would only laugh. As we were getting within 100 yards from the house of the devout friend whom he intended to honor with his visit, he took back his heavy cloak. On entering the house, he gave his blessing to everybody, and everyone in the family came to kiss his hand. The mistress of the house requested him to say mass for them, and the compliant monk asked to be taken to the vestry. But when I whispered in his ear, "Have you forgotten that we have already broken our fast today?" he answered dryly, "Mind your own business." I dared not make any further remark, but during the mass I was indeed surprised, for I saw that he did not understand what he was doing. I could not help being amused at his awkwardness, but I had not yet seen the best part of the comedy. As soon as he had somehow or other finished his mass, he went to the confessional, and after hearing in confession every member of the family, he took it into his head to refuse absolution to the daughter of his hostess, a girl of 12 or 13, pretty and quite charming. He gave his refusal publicly, scolding her and threatening her with the torments of hell. The poor girl, overwhelmed with shame, left the church crying bitterly, and I, feeling real sympathy for her, could not help saying aloud to Stefano that he was a madman. I ran after the girl to offer her my consolations, but she had disappeared, and could not be induced to join us at dinner. This piece of extravagance on the part of the monk exasperated me to such an extent that I felt a very strong inclination to thrash him. In the presence of all the family, I told him that he was an impostor, and the infamous destroyer of the poor child's honor. I challenged him to explain his reasons for refusing to give her absolution, but he closed my lips by answering very coolly that he could not betray the secrets of the confessional. I could eat nothing, and was fully determined to leave the scoundrel. As we left the house, I was compelled to accept 1 paolo as the price of the mock mass he had said. I had to fulfill the sorry duty of his treasurer. The moment we were on the road, I told him that I was going to part company, because I was afraid of being sent as a felon to the galleys if I continued my journeys with him. He exchanged high words. I called him an ignorant scoundrel. He styled me a beggar. I struck him a violent slap on the face, which he returned with a blow from his stick, but I quickly snatched it from him, and leaving him, I hastened toward Macerata. A carrier who was going to Tolentino took me with him for 2 paoli, and for 6 more I might have reached Foglino in a wagon, but unfortunately a wish for economy made me refuse the offer. I felt well, and I thought I could easily walk as far as Valcimare, but I arrived there only after 5 hours of hard walking, and thoroughly beaten with fatigue. I was strong and healthy, but a walk of 5 hours was more than I could bear, because in my infancy I had never gone a league on foot. Young people cannot practice too much the art of walking. The next day, refreshed by a good night's rest, and ready to resume my journey, I wanted to pay the innkeeper, but alas, a new misfortune was in store for me. Let the reader imagine my sad position. I recollected that I had forgotten my purse, containing 7 sequins, on the table of the inn at Tolentino. What a thunderbolt! I was in despair, but I gave up the idea of going back, as it was very doubtful whether I would find my money. Yet it contained all I possessed, save a few copper coins I had in my pocket. I paid my small bill, and, deeply grieved at my loss, continued my journey towards Serravalle. I was within 3 miles of that place, when, in jumping over a ditch, I sprained my ankle, and was compelled to sit down on one side of the road, and to wait until someone should come to my assistance. In the course of an hour, a peasant happened to pass with his donkey, and he agreed to carry me to Serravalle for 1 paolo. As I wanted to spend as little as possible, the peasant took me to an ill-looking fellow who, for 2 paoli paid in advance, consented to give me a lodging. I asked him to send for a surgeon, but I did not obtain one until the following morning. I had a wretched supper, after which I lay down in a filthy bed. I was in hope that sleep would bring me some relief, but my evil genius was preparing for a night of torments. 3 men, armed with guns and looking like banditti, came in shortly after I had gone to bed, speaking in a kind of slang which I could not make out, swearing, raging, and paying no attention to me. They drank and sang until midnight, after which they threw themselves down on bundles of straw brought for them, and my host, who was drunk, came, greatly to my dismay, to lie down near me. Disgusted at the idea of having such a fellow for my bed companion, I refused to let him come, but he answered, with fearful blasphemies, that all the devils in hell could not prevent him from taking possession of his own bed. I was forced to make room for him, and exclaimed, "Heavens, where am I?" He told me that I was in the house of the most honest constable in all the Papal States. Could I possibly have supposed that the peasant would have brought me amongst those accursed enemies of humankind? He laid himself down near me, but the filthy scoundrel soon compelled me to give him, for certain reasons, such a blow in his chest that he rolled out of bed. He picked himself up, and he renewed his beastly attempt. Being well aware that I could not master him without great danger, I got out of bed, thinking myself lucky that he did not oppose my wish, and crawling along as well as I could, found a chair on which I passed the night. At daybreak, my tormentor, caught up by his honest comrades, joined them in drinking and shouting, and the 3 strangers, taking their guns, departed. Left alone by the departure of the vile rabble, I passed another unpleasant hour, calling in vain for someone. At last a young boy came in. I gave him some money, and he went for a surgeon. The doctor examined my foot, and assured me that 3 or 4 days would set me to rights. He advised me to be removed to an inn, and I most willingly followed his counsel. As soon as I was brought to the inn, I went to bed, and was well cared for, but my position was such that I dreaded the moment of my recovery. I feared that I should be compelled to sell my coat to pay the innkeeper, and the very thought made me feel ashamed. I began to consider that if I had controlled my sympathy for the young girl so ill-treated by Stefano, I should not have fallen into this sad predicament, and I felt conscious that my sympathy had been a mistake. If I had put up with the faults of the friar, if this and if that, and every other if was conjured up to torment my restless and wretched brain, yet I must confess that the thoughts which have their origin in misfortune are not without advantage to a young man, for they give him the habit of thinking, and the man who does not think never does anything right. The moment of the 4th day came, and I was able to walk, as the surgeon had predicted. I made up my mind, although reluctantly, to beg the worthy man to sell my great coat for me, a most unpleasant necessity, for rain had begun to fall. I owed 15 paoli to the innkeeper, and 4 to the surgeon. Just as I was going to proffer my painful request, Brother Stefano made his appearance in my room, and burst into loud laughter, inquiring whether I had forgotten the blow from his stick. I was struck with amazement. I begged the surgeon to leave me with the monk, and he immediately complied. I must ask my readers whether it is possible, in the face of such extraordinary circumstances, not to feel superstitious. What is truly miraculous in this case is the precise minute at which the event took place, for the friar entered the room as the word was hanging on my lips. What surprised me most was the force of providence, of fortune, of chance, whatever name is given to it, of that very necessary combination which compelled me to find no hope but in that fatal monk, who had begun to be my protective genius in Chiozza at the moment my distress had likewise commenced. And yet, a singular guardian angel this Stefano. I felt that the mysterious force which threw me in his hands was a punishment rather than a favour. Nevertheless, he was welcome, because I had no doubt of his relieving me from my difficulties, and whatever be the power that sent him to me, I felt that I could not do better than to submit to its influence. The destiny of that monk was to escort me to Rome. "Chi va piano va sano," said the friar, as soon as we were alone. He had taken 5 days to traverse the road over which I had travelled in 1 day, but he was in good health, and he had met with no misfortune. He told me that, as he was passing, he heard that an abbé, secretary to the Venetian ambassador at Rome, was lying ill at the inn, after having been robbed in Balsimara. "I came to see you," he added, "and as I find you recovered from your illness, we can start again together. I agree to walk 6 miles every day to please you. Come, let us forget the past, and let us be at once on our way." "I cannot go. I have lost my purse, and I owe 20 paoli." "I will go and find the amount in the name of St. Francis." He returned within an hour, but he was accompanied by the infamous constable, who told me that, if I had let him know who I was, he would have been happy to keep me in his house. "I will give you," he continued, 40 paoli, if you will promise me the protection of your ambassador. But if you do not succeed in obtaining it for me in Rome, you will undertake to repay me. Therefore, you must give me an acknowledgment of the debt." "I have no objection." Every arrangement was speedily completed. I received the money, paid my debts, and left Serravalle with Stefano. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon we saw a wretched-looking house at a short distance from the road, and the friar said, "It is a good distance from here to Collefiorito. We had better put up there for the night." It was in vain that I objected, remonstrating that we were certain of having very poor accommodation. I had to submit to his will. We found a decrepit old man lying on a pallet, 2 ugly women of 30 or 40, 3 children entirely naked, a cow, and a cursed dog, which barked continually. It was a picture of squalid misery, but the niggardly monk, instead of giving alms to the poor people, asked them to entertain us to supper in the name of St. Francis. "You must boil the hen," said the dying man to the females, "and bring out of the cellar the bottle of wine which I have kept now for 20 years. As he uttered those words, he was seized with such a fit of coughing that I thought he would die. The friar went near him, and promised him that, by the grace of St. Francis, he would get young and well. Moved by the sight of such misery, I wanted to continue my journey as far as Collefiorito, and wait there for Stefano, but the women would not let me go, and I remained. After boiling for 4 hours, the hen set the strongest teeth at defiance, and the bottle which I uncorked proved to be nothing but sour vinegar. Losing patience, I got hold of the monk's baticaslo, and took out of it enough for a plentiful supper, and I saw the 2 women opening their eyes very wide at the sight of our provisions. We all ate with good appetite, and after our supper the women made us for 2 large beds of fresh straw, and we lay down in the dark, as the last bit of candle to be found and the miserable dwelling was burnt out. We had not been lying on the straw 5 minutes, when Stefano called out to me that one of the women had just placed herself near him, and at the same instant the other one takes me in her arms and kisses me. I push her away, and the monk defends himself against the other, but mine, nothing daunted, insists upon laying herself near me. I get up, the dog springs at my neck, and fear compels me to remain quiet on my straw bed. The monk screams, swears, struggles, the dog barks furiously, the old man coughs. All is noise and confusion. At last, Stefano, protected by his heavy garments, shakes off the too loving shrew, and, braving the dog, manages to find his stick. Then he lays about to right and left, striking in every direction. One of the women exclaims, "Oh God!" The friar answers, "She has her quietus." Calm reigns again in the house. The dog, most likely dead, is silent. The old man, who perhaps has received his death blow, coughs no more. The children sleep, and the women, afraid of the singular caresses of the monk, sheer off into a corner. The remainder of the night passed off quietly. At daybreak I rose. Stefano was likewise soon up. I looked all around, and my surprise was great when I found that the women had gone out, and seeing that the old man gave no sign of life, and had a bruise on his forehead, I showed it to Stefano, remarking that very likely he had killed him. "It is possible," he answered, "but I have not done it intentionally." Then, taking up his baticulo, and finding it empty, he flew into a violent passion. But I was much pleased, for I had been afraid that the women had gone out to get assistance and to have us arrested, and the robbery of our provisions reassured me, as I felt certain that the poor wretches had gone out of the way so as to secure impunity for their theft. But I laid great stress upon the danger we should run by remaining any longer, and I succeeded in frightening the friar out of the house. We soon met a wagoner going to Foligno. I persuaded Stefano to take the opportunity of putting a good distance between us and the scene of our last adventures, and as we were eating our breakfast at Foligno, we saw another wagon, quite empty. Got a lift in it for a trifle, and thus wrote to Pisignano, where a devout person gave us a charitable welcome, and I slept soundly through the night without the dread of being arrested. Early the next day we reached Spoletti, where Brother Stefano had 2 benefactors, and careful not to give either of them a cause of jealousy, he favored both. We dined with the first, who entertained us like princes, and we had supper and lodging in the house of the second, a wealthy wine merchant, and the father of a large and delightful family. He gave us a delicious supper, and everything would have gone on pleasantly, had not the friar, already excited by his good dinner, made himself quite drunk. In that state, thinking to please his new host, he began to abuse the other, greatly to my annoyance. He said the wine he had given us to drink was adulterated, and that the man was a thief. I gave him to lie to his face, and called him a scoundrel. The host and his wife pacified me, saying that they were well acquainted with their neighbor, and knew what to think of him. But the monk threw his napkin at my face, and the host took him very quietly by the arm, and put him to bed in a room in which he locked him up. I slept in another room. In the morning I rose early, and was considering whether it would not be better to go alone, when the friar, who had slept himself sober, made his appearance, and told me that we ought for the future live together like good friends, and not give way to angry feelings. I followed my destiny once more. We resumed our journey, and at Soma, the innkeeper, a woman of rare beauty,
gave us a good dinner, and some excellent Cyprus wine, which the Venetian couriers exchanged with her against delicious truffles found in the vicinity of Soma, which sold for a good price in Venice. I did not leave the handsome innkeeper without losing a part of my heart. It would be difficult to draw a picture of the indignation which overpowered me when, as we were about 2 miles from Terni, the infamous friar shewed me a small bag full of truffles, which the scoundrel had stolen from the amiable woman by way of thanks for her generous hospitality. The truffles were worth 2 sequins at last. In my indignation, I snatched the bag from him, saying that I would certainly return it to his lawful owner. But, as he had not committed the robbery to give himself the pleasure of making restitution, he threw himself upon me, and we came to a regular fight. But victory did not remain long in abeyance. I forced his stick out of his hands, knocked him into a ditch, and went off. On reaching Terni, I wrote a letter of apology to our beautiful hostess of Soma, and sent back the truffles. From Terni, I went on foot to Otricoli, where I only stayed long enough to examine the fine old bridge, and from there I paid 4 paoli to a wagoner who carried me to Castelnuovo, from which place I walked to Rome. I reached the celebrated city on the 1st of September, at 9 in the morning. I must not forget to mention here a rather peculiar circumstance, which, however ridiculous it may be in reality, will please many of my readers.
End of Chapter 8, Part B. Chapter 8, Part C of the Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, by Giacomo Casanova. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. The Memoirs of Jacques Casanova, Volume 1, The Venetian Years, by Giacomo Casanova. Episode 2, Cleric in Naples. Chapter 8, Part C. An hour after I had left Castelnuovo, the atmosphere being calm and the sky clear, I perceived on my right, and within 10 paces of me, a pyramidal flame about 2 feet long and 4 or 5 feet above the ground. This apparition surprised me, because it seemed to accompany me. Anxious to examine it, I endeavored to get nearer to it, but the more I advanced towards it, the further it went from me. It would stop when I stood still, and when the road along which I was travelling happened to be lined with trees, I no longer saw it, but it was sure to reappear as soon as I reached a portion of the road without trees. I several times retraced my steps purposely, but every time I did so, the flame disappeared, and would not show itself again until I proceeded towards Rome. This extraordinary beacon left me when daylight chased darkness from the sky. What a splendid field for ignorant superstition, if there had been any witnesses to that phenomenon, and if I had chanced to make a great name in Rome! History is full of such trifles, and the world is full of people who attach great importance to them in spite of the so-called light of science. I must candidly confess that, although somewhat versed in physics, the sight of that small meteor gave me singular ideas. But I was prudent enough not to mention the circumstance to anyone. When I reached the ancient capital of the world, I possessed only 7 paoli, and consequently I did not loiter about. I paid no attention to the splendid entrance through the gate of the polar trees, which is by mistake pompously called of the people, or to the beautiful square of the same name, or to the portals of the magnificent churches, or to all the stately buildings which generally strike the traveller as he enters the city. I went straight towards Monte Magnanopoli, where, according to the address given to me, I was to find the bishop. There I was informed that he had left Rome 10 days before, leaving instructions to send me to Naples free of expense. A coach was to start for Naples the next day. Not caring to see Rome, I went to bed until the time for the departure of the coach. I travelled with 3 low fellows to whom I did not address one word through the whole of the journey. I entered Naples on the 6th day of September. I went immediately to the address which had been given to me in Rome. The bishop was not there. I called at the convent of the Minims, and I found that he had left Naples to proceed to Martorano. I inquired whether he had left any instructions for me, but in vain. No one could give me any information. And there I was, alone in a large city, without a friend, with 8 carlini in my pocket, and not knowing what to do. But never mind. Fate calls me to Martorano, and to Martorano I must go. The distance, after all, is only 200 miles. I found several drivers starting for Cosenza, but when they heard that I had no luggage, they refused to take me unless I paid in advance. They were quite right, but their prudence placed me under the necessity of going on foot. Yet I felt I must reach Martorano, and I made up my mind to walk the distance, begging food and lodging like the very reverend Bard Stefano. First of all, I made a light meal for 1/4 of my money, and having been informed that I had to follow the Salerno road, I went towards Portici, where I arrived in an hour and a half. I already felt rather fatigued. My legs, if not my head, took me to an inn, where I ordered a room and some supper. I was served in good style, my appetite was excellent, and I passed a quiet night in a comfortable bed. In the morning I told the innkeeper that I would return for my dinner, and went out to visit the royal palace. As I passed through the gate, I was met by a man of prepossessing appearance, dressed in the Eastern fashion, who offered to shew me all over the place, saying that I would thus save my money. I was in a position to accept any offer. I thanked him for his kindness. Happening during the conversation to state that I was a Venetian, he told me that he was my subject, since he came from Zante. I acknowledged his polite compliment with a reverence. "I have," he said, "some very excellent muscatel wine, grown in the East, which I could sell you cheap. I might buy some, but I warn you I am a good judge. So much the better. Which do you prefer?" "The Cerigo wine." "You are right. I have some rare Cerigo muscatel, and we can taste it if you have no objection to dine with me." "None whatsoever." "I can likewise give you the wines of Samos and Cephalonia. I have also a quantity of minerals, plenty of vitriol, cinnabar, antimony, and 100 quintals of mercury." "Are all these goods here?" "No, they are in Naples. Here I have only the muscatel wine and the mercury." It is quite naturally, and without any intention to deceive, that a young man accustomed to poverty, and ashamed of it when he speaks to a rich stranger, boasts of his means, of his fortune. As I was talking with my new acquaintance, I recollected an amalgam of mercury with lead and bismuth, by which the mercury increases 1/4 in weight. I said nothing, but I bethought myself that if the mystery should be unknown to the Greek, I might profit by it. I felt that some cunning was necessary, and that he would not care for my secret if I proposed to sell it to him without preparing the way. The best plan was to astonish my man with the miracle of the augmentation of mercury, treat it as a jest, and see what his intentions would be. Cheating is a crime, but honest cunning may be considered as a species of prudence. True, it is a quality which is near akin to roguery, but that cannot be helped. and the man who, in time of need, does not know how to exercise his cunning nobly is a fool. The Greeks call this sort of wisdom serdaleophion, from the word sardo, fox, and it might be translated by foxdom, if there were such a word in English. After we had visited the place, we returned to the inn, and the Greek took me to his room, in which he ordered the table to be laid for two. In the next room, I saw several large vessels of muscatel wine, and 4 flagons of mercury, each containing about 10 pounds. My plans were laid out, and I asked him to let me have one of the flagons of mercury at the current price, and took it to my room. The Greek went out to attend to his business, reminding me that he expected me to dinner. I went out likewise, and bought 2 pounds and a half of lead, and an equal quantity of bismuth. The druggist had no more. When I came back to the inn, asked for some large empty bottles, and made the amalgam. We dined very pleasantly, and the Greek was delighted because I pronounced his serigo excellent. In the course of conversation, he inquired laughingly why I had bought one of his flagons of mercury. "You can find out if you come to my room," I said. After dinner, we repaired to my room, and he found his mercury divided in 2 vessels. I asked for a piece of chamois, strained the liquid through it, filled his own flagon, and the Greek stood astonished at the sight of the fine mercury, about 1/4 of a flagon, which remained over, with an equal quantity of a powder unknown to him. It was the bismuth. My merry laugh kept company with his astonishment, and calling one of the servants of the inn, I sent him to the druggist to sell the mercury that was left. He returned in a few minutes, and handed me 15 carlini. The Greek, whose surprise was complete, asked me to give him back his own flagon, which was quite full, and worth 60 carlini. I handed it to him with a smile, thanking him for the opportunity he had afforded me of earning 15 carlini, and took care to add that I should leave for Salerno early the next morning. "Then we must have supper tonight this evening," he said. During the afternoon, we took a walk towards Mount Vesuvius. Our conversation went from one subject to another, but no allusion was made to the mercury, though I could see that the Greek had something on his mind. At supper, he told me, jestingly, that I ought to stop in Portici the next day to make 45 carlini out of the 3 other flagons of mercury. I answered gravely that I did not want the money, and that I had augmented the first flagon only for the sake of procuring him an agreeable surprise. "But," he said, "you must be very wealthy." "No, I am not, because I am in search of the secret of the augmentation of gold, and it is a very expensive study for us." "How many are there in your company?" "Only my uncle and myself." "What do you want to augment gold for? The augmentation of mercury ought to be enough for you. Pray tell me whether the mercury augmented by you today is again susceptible of a similar increase." "No. If it were so, it would be an immense source of wealth for us." "I am much pleased with your sincerity." Supper over, I paid my bill, and asked the landlord to get me a carriage and pair of horses to take me to Salerno early the next morning. I thanked the Greek for his delicious muscatel wine, and, requesting his address in Naples, I assured him that he would see me within a fortnight, as I was determined to secure a cask of his serigo. We embraced each other, and I retired to bed well pleased with my day's work, and in no way astonished at the Greek's not offering to purchase my secret, for I was certain that he would not sleep for anxiety, and that I should see him early in the next morning. At all events, I had enough money to reach the Tour du Grec, and there Providence would take care of me. Yet it seemed to me very difficult to travel as far as Martorano, begging like a mendicant friar. because my outward appearance did not excite pity. People would feel interested in me only from a conviction that I needed nothing, a very unfortunate conviction, when the object of it is truly poor. As I had foreseen, the Greek was in my room at daybreak. I received him in a friendly way, saying that we could take coffee together. "Willingly, but tell me, Reverend Abbé, whether you would feel disposed to sell me your secret." "Why not, when we meet in Naples? But why not now?" "I am expected in Salerno. Besides, I would only sell the secret for a large sum of money, and I am not acquainted with you." "That does not matter, as I am sufficiently known here to pay you in cash. How much would you want?" 2,000 ounces. "I agree to pay you that sum, provided that I succeed in making the augmentation myself with such matter as you name to me, which I will purchase." "It is impossible, because the necessary ingredients cannot be got here, but they are common enough in Naples." "If it is any sort of metal, we can get it at the Tour du Grec. We could go there together. Can you tell me what is the expense of the augmentation?" 1.5%, but you are likewise known at the Tour du Grec, for I should not like to lose my time." "Your doubts grieve me." Saying which, he took a pen, wrote a few words, and handed to me this order: "At sight, pay to bearer the sum of 50 gold ounces, on account of Panagiotti." He told me that the banker resided within 200 yards of the inn, and he pressed me to go there myself. I did not stand upon ceremony, but went to the banker, who paid me the amount. I returned to my room, in which he was waiting for me, and placed the gold on the table, saying that we could now proceed together to the Tour du Grec, where we would complete our arrangements after the signature of a deed of agreement. The Greek had his own carriage and horses. He gave orders for them to be got ready, and we left the inn, but he had nobly insisted upon my taking possession of the 50 ounces. When we arrived at the Tour du Grec, he signed a document by which he promised to pay me 2,000 ounces as soon as I should have discovered to him the process of augmenting mercury by 1/4 without injuring its quality, the amalgam to be equal to the mercury which I had sold in his presence at Portici. He then gave me a bill of exchange payable at sight in 8 days on Mr. Gennaro de Carlo. I told him that the ingredients were lead and bismuth, the first combining with mercury, and the second giving to the whole the perfect fluidity necessary to strain it through the chamois leather. The Greek went out to try the amalgam. I did not know where, and I dined alone, but toward evening he came back, looking very disconsolate, as I had expected. "I have made the amalgam," he said, "but the mercury is not perfect. It is equal to that which I have sold in Portici, and that is the very letter of your engagement." "But my engagement says likewise without injury to the quality. You must agree that the quality is injured, because it is no longer susceptible of further augmentation." "You knew that to be the case. The point is its equality with the mercury I sold in Portici." "But we shall have to go to law, and you will lose. I am sorry the secret should become public. Congratulate yourself, sir, for if you should gain the lawsuit, you will have obtained my secret for nothing. I would never have believed you capable of deceiving me in such a manner." "Reverend sir, I can assure you that I would not willingly deceive anyone." "Do you know the secret, or do you not? Do you suppose I would have given it to you without the agreement we entered into? Well, there will be some fun over this affair in Naples, and the lawyers will make money out of it. But I am much grieved at this turn of affairs, and I am very sorry that I allowed myself to be so easily deceived by your fine talk. In the meantime, here are your 50 ounces." as I was taking the money out of my pocket, frightened to death lest he should accept it, he left the room, saying that he would not have it. He soon returned. We had supper in the same room, but at separate tables. War had been openly declared, but I felt certain that a treaty of peace would soon be signed. We did not exchange one word during the evening, but in the morning he came to me as I was getting ready to go. I again offered to return the money I received, but he told me to keep it, and proposed to give me 50 ounces more if I would give him back his bill of exchange for 2,000. We began to argue the matter quietly, and after 2 hours of discussion I gave in. I received 50 ounces more. We dined together like old friends, and embraced each other cordially. As I was bidding him adieu, he gave me an order on his house at Naples for a barrel of muscatel wine, and he presented me with a splendid box containing 12 razors with silver handles, manufactured in the Tour du Grec. We parted, the best friends in the world, and well pleased with each other. I remained 2 days in Salerno to provide myself with linen and other necessaries. Possessing about 100 sequins, and enjoying good health, I was very proud of my success, in which I could not see any cause to reproach to myself, for the cunning I had brought into play to ensure the sale of my secret could not be found fault with, except by the most intolerant of moralists, and such men have no authority to speak on matters of business. At all events, free, rich, and certain of presenting myself before the bishop with a respectable appearance, and not like a beggar, I soon recovered my natural spirits, and congratulated myself upon having brought sufficient experience to ensure me against falling a second time an easy prey to a Father Corsini, to thieving gamblers, to mercenary women, and particularly to the impudent scoundrels who barefacedly praise so well those they intend to dupe, a species of knaves very common in the world, even amongst people who form what is called good society. I left Salerno with 2 priests who were going to Cosenza on business, and we traversed the distance of 142 miles in 22 hours. The day after my arrival in the capital of Calabria, I took a small carriage and drove to Martorano. During the journey, fixing my eyes upon the famous Mare Ausunum, I felt delighted at finding myself in the middle of Magna Graecia, rendered so celebrated for 24 centuries by its connection with Pythagoras. I looked with astonishment upon a country renowned for its fertility, and in which, in spite of nature's prodigality, my eyes met everywhere the aspect of terrible misery, the complete absence of that pleasant superfluity which helps man to enjoy life, and the degradation of the inhabitants sparsely scattered on a soil where they ought to be so numerous. I felt ashamed to acknowledge them as originating from the same stock as myself. Such is, however, the terra di lavoro, where labour seems to be execrated, where everything is cheap, where the miserable inhabitants consider that they have made a good bargain when they have found any one disposed to take care of the fruit which the ground supplies almost spontaneously in too great abundance, and for which there is no market. I felt compelled to admit the justice of the Romans who had called them brutes instead of Boeotians. The good priest with whom I had been travelling laughed at my dread of the tarantula and of the crassida, for the disease brought on by the bite of those insects appeared to me more fearful even than a certain disease with which I was already too well acquainted. They assured me that all the stories relating to those creatures were fables. They laughed at the lines which Virgil had devoted to them in the Georgics, as well as at all those I quoted to justify my fears. I found Bishop Bernard de Bernardis occupying a hard chair near an old table on which he was writing. I fell on my knees, as it is customary to do before a prelate, but instead of giving me his blessing, he raised me up from the floor, and, folding me in his arms, embraced me tenderly. He expressed his deep sorrow when I told him that in Naples I had not been able to find any instructions to enable me to join him, but his face lighted up again when I added that I was indebted to no one for money, and that I was in good health. He bade me take a seat, and with a heavy sigh he began to talk of his poverty, and ordered a servant to lay the cloths for 3 persons. Besides this servant, his lordship's suite consisted of a most devout-looking housekeeper, and of a priest whom I judged to be very ignorant from the few words he uttered during our meal. The house inhabited by his lordship was large, but badly built and poorly kept. The furniture was so miserable that, in order to make up a bed for me in the room adjoining his chamber, the poor bishop had to give up one of his 2 mattresses. His dinner, not to say any more about it, frightened me, for he was very strict in keeping the rules of his order, and this being a fast day, he did not eat any meat, and the oil was very bad. Nevertheless, Monsignor was an intelligent man, and, what is still better, an honest man. He told me, much to my surprise, that his bishopric, although not one of little importance, brought him only 500 ducat di regno yearly, and that, unfortunately, he had contracted debts to the amount of 600. He added, with a sigh, that his only happiness was to feel himself out of the clutches of the monks, who had persecuted him, and made his life perfectly purgatory for 15 years. All these confidences caused me sorrow and mortification, because they proved to me not only that I was not in the promised land where a mitre could be picked up, but also that I would be a heavy charge for him. I felt that he was grieved himself at the sorry present his patronage seemed likely to prove. I inquired whether he had a good library, whether there were any literary men, or any good society in which one could spend a few agreeable hours. He smiled, and answered that throughout his diocese there was not one man who could boast of writing decently, and still less of any taste or knowledge in literature, that there was not a single bookseller, nor any person caring even for the newspapers. But he promised me that we would follow our literary tastes together, as soon as he received the books he had ordered from Naples. That was all very well, but was this the place for a young man of 18 to live in, without a good library, without good society, without emulation and literary intercourse? The good bishop, seeing me full of sad thoughts, and almost astounded at the prospect of the miserable life I should have to lead with him, tried to give me courage by promising to do everything in his power to secure my happiness. The next day, the bishop having to officiate in his pontifical robes, I had an opportunity of seeing all the clergy, and all the faithful of the diocese, men and women, of whom the cathedral was full. The sight made me resolve at once to leave Martorano. I thought I was gazing upon a troop of brutes, for whom my external appearance was a cause of scandal. How ugly were the women! What a look of stupidity and coarseness in the men! When I returned to the bishop's house, I told the prelate that I did not feel in me the vocation to die within a few months a martyr in this miserable city. "Give me your blessing," I said, "and let me go, or rather come with me. I promise you that we shall make a fortune somewhere else." The proposal made him laugh repeatedly during the day. Had he agreed to it, he would not have died 2 years afterwards in the prime of manhood. The worthy man, feeling how natural was my repugnance, begged me to forgive him for having summoned me to him, and, considering it his duty to send me back to Venice, having no money himself and not being aware that I had any, he told me that he would give me an introduction to a worthy citizen of Naples, who would lend me 60 ducati di regno to enable me to reach my native city. I accepted his offer with gratitude. At going to my room, I took out of my trunk the case of fine razors which the Greek had given me, and begged his acceptance of it as a souvenir of me. I had great difficulty in forcing it upon him, for it was worth the 60 ducats, and to conquer his resistance I had to threaten to remain with him if he refused my present. He gave me a very flattering letter of recommendation for the Archbishop of Cosenza, in which he requested him to forward me as far as Naples, without any expense to myself. It was thus I left Martorano 60 hours after my arrival, pitying the bishop whom I was leaving behind, and who wept as he was pouring heartfelt blessings upon me. The Archbishop of Cosenza, a man of wealth and of intelligence, offered me a room in his palace. During the dinner I made, with an overflowing heart, the eulogy of the Bishop of Martorano, but I railed mercilessly at his diocese and at the whole of Calabria in so cutting a manner that I greatly amused the bishop and all his guests, among whom were 2 ladies, his relatives, who did the honours of the dinner table. The youngest, however, objected to the satirical style in which I had depicted her country, and declared war against me. But I contrived to obtain peace again by telling her that Calabria would be a delightful country if 1/4 only of its inhabitants were like her. Perhaps it was the idea of proving to me that I had been wrong in my opinion that the Archbishop gave on the following day a splendid supper. Cosenza is a city in which a gentleman can find plenty of amusement. The nobility are wealthy, the women are pretty, and men generally well informed, because they have been educated in Naples or in Rome. I left Cosenza on the 3rd day with a letter from the Archbishop for the far-famed Genovesi. I had 5 travelling companions, whom I judged, from their appearance, to be either pirates or banditti, and I took very good care not to let them see or guess that I had a well-filled purse. Likewise, I thought it prudent to go to bed without undressing during the whole journey, an excellent measure of prudence for a young man travelling in that part of the country. I reached Naples on the 16th of September, 1743, and I lost no time in presenting the letter of the Bishop of Martorano. It was addressed to a Mr. Gennaro Polo at St. Anne's. This excellent man, whose duty was only to give me the sum of 60 ducats, insisted, after perusing the bishop's letter, upon receiving me in his house, because he wished me to make the acquaintance of his son, who was a poet like myself. The bishop had represented my poetry as sublime. After the usual ceremonies, I accepted this kind invitation. My trunk was sent for, and I was a guest in the house of Mr. Gennaro Polo. End of chapter 8.